Ever since he was a kid, Callum Wells had been seeing weird stuff. Monsters, magical creatures, and even mages secretly living among people. But one day he found out he had magical powers himself. His excitement didn't last long, though. The Guild of Magical Regulation kept tabs on every mage on Earth, keeping them under strict control. Callum wasn't about to put up with that and decided he wouldn't be the Guild's puppet. Over time, he became one of the most dangerous criminals in the world. But that's skipping ahead. Let's start at the beginning. A month ago, the main character was completely lost, not knowing what was happening or where he was. Callum had been detained by Agent Terran of the Guild. He was accused of being involved in an attack on a fitness center in Shanghai. They explained to him that magic was real, and he was a mage whether he liked it or not. During interrogation, Callum said he had been at his mother's funeral that morning. There he'd met a strange man with an otherworldly aura. Someone just like those he had seen before? These people were invisible to everyone else, but not to him. After meeting the man, Callum suddenly got a splitting headache. One of these people was Mr. Shanghai, the gym owner who often helped Callum. Callum had seen him in the form of a demon dragon. That day, Shanghai had asked Callum to help Maria, a new member, settle in. The guy approached the girl and they started talking. She agreed to his help. But suddenly she felt unwell and collapsed on the floor, unconscious. Callum rushed to her immediately. At that moment, criminals burst into the gym. Gunfire erupted. Shanghai, protecting everyone, revealed his true nature. A fiery demon emerged from within him. Callum struggled to stay conscious, watching the flames engulf the gym. But as the smoke thickened, he began to lose strength. A few minutes later, he came to. Seeing Maria, Callum decided he'd save her no matter what. He picked her up and walked through the fire, avoiding sparks from exposed wires. One of the wires shocked him, but Callum didn't stop. Just as he was about to collapse, a purple glow appeared beneath his feet. In an instant, a portal opened, transporting them to the street. Callum was in shock. He couldn't understand what had just happened. But he didn't get a chance to catch his breath. An agent from the Guild of Magical Regulation spotted him immediately. The agent quickly extinguished the burning gym with magic. Then he demanded that Callum explain himself. The agent claimed that dragonfire was found in the gym and began questioning Callum about his magical abilities. Callum just shrugged helplessly. He had no idea what they were talking about. Then, a magic-blocking bracelet snapped onto his wrist. It instantly relieved his splitting headache. Before he could process what was happening, Callum was roughly dragged to the Guild's headquarters. There, the leadership was surprised. Despite the bracelet, the guy was still conscious. What's more, he had used unknown magic to save someone from the fire. The agents couldn't figure out how a 30-year-old mage had remained unregistered, especially since his family was completely ordinary. Agent Sen admitted that the gym incident wasn't Callum's fault, but registration was mandatory. Mages were trained from childhood and assigned roles within the guild, but Callum was an exception. When Callum tried to refuse, saying he was an architect and didn't need their help, the agent coldly explained, deserters and unregistered mages were considered a threat. They were hunted down and eliminated to prevent problems for others. Callum realized he had no choice. He was trapped. Callum had to undergo mandatory training before he could be assigned. The guild demanded complete submission, threatening death for refusal, but he wasn't going to put up with that. Agent Sen informed him that the first test would begin. A device was supposed to inject mana into him to determine his magic type. Callum didn't feel anything at first. But soon he was gripped by excruciating pain. He screamed, trying to stop the process, eventually collapsing unconscious on the floor. But after a few minutes, he came to. It turned out that age played a role. Such tests weren't conducted on adults like him. While he was unconscious, they placed a magical mark on him. Callum realized that his freedom meant nothing to the guild. They explained to him that he was a spatial magician and such mages were rare. They didn't want to let him go without an escort. He couldn't help but feel that he was being used, but he agreed to have a mentor. They offered him Agent Sen, who would stay with him until his assignment. On the way, Callum asked where they were taking him. Based on his abilities, they might send him to the transportation department. Sen explained that he worked as a pyromancer and aeromancer, often being sent to the front lines. The guild was responsible for hunting down criminal mages and protecting the worlds, supplying Earth with mana. These were worlds inhabited by vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural beings. Callum remained skeptical, but he couldn't ignore that his world was changing. They arrived at the lounge, and the hero settled into his room. Agent Sen handed him a computer with information about magic, warning him that he would be taken back to headquarters the next day. He started going through the information and quickly realized that magical energy was divided into two categories, mana and vis. Mana was something like the atmosphere of Earth from which mages draw energy. Vis was the mage's own energy, with a specific focus. For example, he had a talent for spatial magic. Though he wanted to learn as much as possible, the material was only the basics. Mages studied all this from childhood, starting in magical kindergarten, and he was falling behind. So he decided to practice with something simple. He focused on the pen on the table, reaching out for it, and magic began to flow from him. The pen started to levitate. But due to his inexperience, one wrong move, and it shot up to the ceiling, getting stuck there. Despite this, he was satisfied. The magic worked, but he needed to learn how to control his viz. He realized that for starting magical regulation, being a pack mule might not be so bad. It would give him a chance to practice. But he was increasingly troubled by the fact that he had actually gotten into a secret organization that had gathered the most powerful people from around the world. And such an organization couldn't not have its dark secrets. He didn't want to become their pawn in someone's game. While reading the information, he realized that the distribution of mages in the guild could lead to deadly consequences. Combat confrontations, activity in the worlds of the 6 portals, the mortality rate was over 50%. Most often, mages who didn't work for big families or the guild died. Archmages lived for centuries, and they tried to subjugate everyone. Callum realized that in such a system, his life wouldn't be worth anything. Closing the laptop, he decided not to worry about it anymore. He'd rather die than give up his freedom. While Agent Sen was fast asleep, Callum decided to act. He opened the safes and took the money. If he wanted to disappear, he needed to prepare ahead of time. He packed everything into a bag and headed for the window. As soon as he stuck his head out, the floor beneath him creaked. The agent immediately opened his eyes and jumped up, running into another room. He realized the target had escaped, and fury filled him. A green glow of magic surrounded him in his anger. Now he was curious how far Callum would manage to run. Callum was gripped by panic fear. He had to get away as quickly as possible. He thought he'd managed to get away from Sen, but the agent's words came to mind. That he was a pyromancer and an aeromancer. He now realized that the agent might have the abilities to move quickly. A force appeared around Sen, lifting him into the air. Callum had no doubt. He had no chance of escape. Agent Sen thought his act was stupid and realized that Callum would need a good explanation. Otherwise, he would make an enemy in the guild, and then an even more dangerous agent was sure to catch up with him. Sen didn't waste any time. He decided to act. Looking around the crowd, he found his target. As soon as he saw him, he instantly shot down, flying right over Callum's head. Callum noticed him and tried to speed up. He hadn't expected to get here so fast, but he was ready. The boy was right. There was no hiding from him. The wind picked up all around, and people began to wonder if it was a storm. Callum realized that the agent's stealth had worked. He flew within a millimeter of their faces, but no one noticed. It was a property of his magic. Now he had to think of another way to avoid pursuit. Callum ran past the store, noticing the new clothes, figuring it would help him disguise himself. The agent continuing to look for him in the crowd. He noticed a guy wearing similar clothes. However, upon looking at his face, he realized it wasn't Callum. Suddenly under his feet, he noticed the bag of the magician he was looking for. When he opened it, he found that it was empty. Annoyed, the agent realized that the guy had been too cunning. Meanwhile, Callum managed to get into a vacant cab, ordering the driver to drive to the Westlesea farm and avoid the highway, to avoid being seen by commercial airplanes. He knew that if he spent a little money, he could rent a corn cob and fly to a quiet town. Although his new clothes concealed him, Callum realized that he couldn't hide in them for long. So when he was alone, he decided to radically change his appearance. He took a pair of scissors and cut his hair, dyeing it black. Then he went to a magic pawn shop to get a regular ID. The seller demanded $2,000 and Callum, having paid, also gave the laptop, getting new IDs with the name Chase Hall. He thought this should work. The guild wouldn't trace him and he would regain his freedom. There was panic at the guild. They couldn't understand how Callum had escaped from under their noses. They had planned to spend the night and had only cast the spell on the doors, not expecting the mage to decide to jump out the window. The agent searched the room but found no magical traces. This confirmed that he had simply escaped. Archmage Duval was furious to learn that a mage with such abilities was missing. Agent Jean, making excuses, reported that he had even sought help from vampires and werewolves but couldn't reach an agreement with them. He also added that learning spatial magic is extremely difficult, and maybe the guy wanted to live an ordinary life. Duval did not believe that Callum could give up his power, considering him a criminal mage. Using magic, the Archmage threw the agent to the floor with force, ordering him to continue his search. She admitted that she prayed that Callum would be found as soon as possible, or she would have to deal with the situation herself. If the hero did decide to become a criminal, her job would be to catch him immediately and execute him. A small town in the west. Callum, who introduced himself as Chase Hall, came to buy a house. Sheriff Arthur Langley and his wife Jessica met him at the door. As Callum looked around the house, he noted its seclusion and quietness. It was a quiet place to live and do repairs. When Jessica asked if he was too young to retire, Callum confidently replied that he needed to rest and improve his health. The deal went through quickly. The family had been trying to sell the house for a long time. The next day, Callum moved into his new home. The money was enough for 2 years of quiet living, but he was still worried. He knew, if he didn't deal with magic, the Guild of Magical Regulation would find him quickly. Spatial magic is surrounded by mysteries. The reference books only mention portals and basic spells. But without a teacher like Archmage Duval, progress remained in doubt. After trying to open his first portal, Callum realized he was acting more on instinct. The next time he concentrated, he stretched out his arm, and the portal opened, albeit only a couple of meters. It was a success. Inspired, he began to look for new ways to use magic. On Monday, discovering that he had run out of shampoo, Callum used a portal to get a new bottle from the cupboard. It worked. By Wednesday, he knew how to form a vis sphere, a basic element of magical training that children would master. The sphere had no attacking properties, but it looked impressive. By Friday, Callum had moved on. Contrary to the manuals that said telekinesis was only available to martial artists, he had learned to manipulate gravity. This became his telekinesis for the poor. Spatial magic was misused, but Callum made the most of it. On Sunday, he went to his yard to practice. Concentrating, he began to use the mana around him and closed his eyes. After a while, he realized that he could see without opening his eyes and look through objects. It was a difficult technique with limited range, but significant progress. Suddenly, he saw Jessica through the wall. As he approached her, he learned that school was about to start, and the kids could take a shortcut through his yard. Callum assured her that it wouldn't be a problem, even though he hadn't had time to clear the yard himself yet. Jessica replied that the kids would be happy to help, since they loved being outdoors. Equal sign, she suggested that he stop by for a visit, and Callum promised to do so. After the conversation, he was overcome with panic. He was afraid that Jessica had noticed the traces of his training. Vis was everywhere, and leftover mana was at every turn. If someone recognized the magic traces, his identity would be quickly revealed. Callum realized that he had to learn how to hide these marks, or the disguise wouldn't last long. Meanwhile, the lab received the results of the test he had done earlier. The data showed that he had not used magic up to that point. However, anomalies were detected. The scientists didn't notice it immediately until they checked the gauges. It turned out that Callum had dissipated 100 toms of mana, a unit of measurement for magical energy. This was strange in itself, but even more surprising was that the bracelet Callum was wearing only had 3 toms left in it. This meant that he had somehow absorbed 97 tomas of mana before the bracelet recorded his condition. For a beginner, this was incredible. Such amounts of energy couldn't be sustained without experience. If he had truly never used magic, his supply of vis should have been full. The scientists didn't understand what any of this meant. Callum had cast no spells, and the energy reserve in his bracelet was nearly empty. His 30 years of inactivity in magic had left more questions than answers, and now no one knew who he really was. Callum continued his training, focusing on controlling vis, the unique magical energy inherent in every mage. He placed the bearing on the table and activated the magic, made him twist and fly into the air. This was a trick he'd learned from the internet. The whirlwind spell allowed him to collect residual magical energy in his bearings, hiding traces of vis. This method made it harder for the Magic Regulation Guild to track his magic. Several weeks passed, and Callum noticed significant progress. However, instead of joy, he felt emptiness. His escape coincided with the day of his mother's funeral, and he didn't have time to say goodbye. The loss of his parents, his wife, and his hometown left a deep wound in his soul. As he looked around his new home, he wondered if Selena would like it here, but the thoughts quickly disappeared, giving way to a focus on survival. The guild was after him, and Callum couldn't afford to lose. He decided to learn more about the town so he could blend in better with the locals. On one day, he visited a restaurant. The girl at the front desk, noticing him for the first time, offered to recommend a dish. But Callum felt something strange. His magic suggested that there was a large cellar under the building, much larger than expected. What surprised him most, however, was the huge dog, almost human-sized, that he saw through the walls. The musings were interrupted by Sheriff Arthur Langley, who came up to speak. The man was friendly and advised me to try the steaks prepared by his niece. He praised the local children, who he said were well-mannered and never entered other people's yards without permission. But the sheriff also mentioned suspicious people showing up in the neighborhood. He asked Callum to let him know if he noticed anything strange. These words alarmed Callum. It seemed to him that the sheriff suspected him. However, Arthur admitted that he had only warned a few people and realized that Callum was not at all like the people in question. Nevertheless, the protagonist could not get rid of the idea that these suspicious people were agents of the Guild of Magical Regulation. Having finished his lunch, Callum walked out to his car. He realized that if the guild had found him, it was probably due to the mark on his arm left over from his experiments. Determination to get rid of the mark became his first priority. Callum scrutinized the dot in the center of the tattoo on his arm. It limited his magic, signaling that he was a space mage. He decided to get rid of it, channeling magical energy into the mark. He began to affect it. But the tattoo began to spark, and he felt a sharp burn. Despite the pain, he managed to extract a small balloon from the center of the tattoo. It was a success. The rest of the mark was to disappear in time. So Callum threw the balloon into the fire where it burned. The next day, Callum wondered how to use the vortex spell to hold and release Visi. Creating portals and minor spells was no longer difficult, but their scope depended on his magical energy. Then he got the idea to create a system like a power bank to recharge Visit. This could save him in a critical situation if an emergency escape was needed. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. Callum was wary. What if it was the agents of the Magic Regulation Guild? Activating his magic, he peered through the door to see who had come. It was Sheriff Arthur Langley. Calming down, Callum opened the door and asked what was wrong. Arthur inquired where Wells had been last night around 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock last night, Callum already suspected that all was not as it seemed. Thinking about the strange dog-like creature had increased his suspicions. Langley's family were werewolves. He believed it more and more. But the question remained as to what the sheriff was really trying to say in the cafe. To scare him or to warn him? Callum decided to rest. But suddenly there were strange noises outside the window. He jumped up, not knowing what was happening. When he looked out, he noticed a figure, but he could not see it exactly. He went outside with a lantern, but it was dark. Could have thought he was making something up, but again he heard the wind and rustling. Panic seized him, and he hurried back into the house, closing the door. The sheriff was in no hurry to jump to conclusions. He asked not to be angry, explaining that he just had to ask a question. Callum replied that he had been sleeping, but inquired what had happened. Arthur clarified if there was evidence, such as from the security system. Callum said he didn't have a camera, and he practiced magic too often in the backyard. Even if there was a system, he wouldn't have hooked it up. The sheriff said there had been a murder outside. Old Man Hardy had been killed, and maybe someone had broken into his house. Admitting that he had seen nothing, Callum told how he had been awakened last night by a strange noise. And he thought it was a beast, but he didn't know anything else. The sheriff thanked him for the information and promised to get in touch if more details came to light. The workman left, but Arthur felt that Callum was hiding something. True, neither he nor the sheriff believed he was the killer. Although both knew who was really guilty, Arthur hoped to the end that he was not. The sheriff remembered the conversation with the vampire when he said he couldn't kill people in the territory of the Venuta pack. The vampire had brushed it off, stating that if one of his men died, it wasn't his problem. Arthur was certain. The vampires were behind the murder. They tried to convince him they weren't involved, but such creatures always leave traces. The vampire just shrugged his shoulders and said he didn't understand his guilt. There were no vampires in the area, and he was sure it wasn't his subordinates. Arthur promised to hold them accountable, but was ready to face them if the Venuta pack decided to challenge them. The sheriff was furious. He took a swing at them, but sensing the vampire's gaze, restrained himself and asked the deputy to get the vampire out of his sight. Afterward, Arthur told Jessica that the vampires had killed one of the civilians, and apparently would continue to do so until they were stopped. He was unable to contact their leader, and the vampire himself, according to him, was nothing. Arthur decided to contact Alpha Chester, but knew that without proof, the Guild of Magical Regulation would not intervene. He was going to send 2 wolves from his pack, but if he ran into vampires, he couldn't expect any help from the guild. They suspected that there was more than just criminals behind it all. The question was not when the vampires would kill, but who. The situation was similar in the other 5 cities, and if they caught the vampires red-handed, they could destroy them. The protagonist knew he had to be as careful as possible. Although he had enough money, he saved some for emergencies. The murders and werewolves made him paranoid, and he began to consider leaving Venut. But considering how much money he had invested in his house, that scenario seemed the worst possible scenario. To make some extra money, he thought about selling enchanted items on magical forums, but creating an account would mean risking being discovered. Oh, and his magic on his bearings only lasted an hour and a half, making such items practically useless for sale. He decided to fortify his home, such as enchanting the walls with gravity to reflect bullets. However, he was unable to cast the spell for more than a minute. For the complex techniques of spatial magic, he lacked the knowledge guarded by the Archmage, Duval. Without access to these techniques, he felt as if he were reinventing the wheel from scratch. Looking for ways to protect himself, he went to the armory. A gun and bullets might not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but it was at least a step forward. Unexpectedly, he met Jessica and her daughter, who were picking out a hammer. He inquired if they were concerned about the murder. The girls said they knew the murdered Joan, who often attended their church. This came as a shock to him. He had thought all along that it was about James Hardy. Jessica reported that there had been another murder last night. Callum was shocked. If it's a serial killer, the situation becomes catastrophic. 2 murders in such a short time meant that the next death could happen today. He realized that he now had 2 threats, a serial killer with supernatural powers and a magic regulation guild that could send agents to investigate. Both could show up on his doorstep at any moment. He decided to use his spatial sense to keep the situation under control. He enchanted his bearings, loaded his weapons, and extended his perception radius to see what was going on in the city. He noticed Jessica guarding the cafe. Clara heads to the store, and the sheriff is at his station, but the exertion exhausted him, and he soon fell asleep. In the morning, he was awakened by Jessica's screams. She, all in tears, ran to Mr. Hall. Callum immediately realized that something terrible had happened. When he asked what had happened, the girl shouted out in despair that they had taken Clara. Callum tried to make sense of what was happening. Jessica tearfully explained that Clara had been kidnapped by vampires. They waited for her in an alley, surrounding her with an ominous aura, and demanded to go with them. Now, she said, the girl was in their lair and they were probably taunting her. Jessica begged Callum to help, but he doubted whether to reveal his knowledge of the supernatural. She had seen the real him before he had learned to hide his magic, and he feared it might have played against him. Nevertheless, Callum suggested that Jessica come inside to talk things over. The vampires could kill her at any moment, and his chances of defeating them alone were slim to none. But as long as she was alive, he had hope. Taking the shotgun, he promised Jessica he would do his best, but warned that he would need more information. Leaving the house, he headed for his car, but his magical sense picked up something strange nearby. Stopping outside an old hotel, he realized that a strange anomaly lurked there. Jessica suddenly suggested that he seek help from her family. She led him to a house where it turned out that her relatives were werewolves, many of whom were local police officers. Sheriff Arthur greeted them with obvious irritation. He felt that bringing outsiders into the case was a risky move, especially when it came to the Magic Regulation Guild. However, Callum was quick to assure that he had nothing to do with the guild. That calmed the sheriff down a bit, but he still remained on edge. The conversation quickly turned to the vampires who had settled in the hotel. The werewolves had sensed their presence for days now, but were unable to act due to the restrictions imposed by the guild. The sheriff explained that despite the vampires' atrocities, the pack could not attack without proof. If they started a fight, the guild would consider them aggressors. It was a subtle game in which every action could have serious consequences. Callum decided to use his spatial sense to find Clara. Concentrating, he saw her in one of the hotel rooms. The vampires claimed that Clara had come to them willingly, but this only made the sheriff angry. He declared that it was a brazen lie and promised that as soon as the girl was rescued, he would call in reinforcements from the best pack to finish off the bloodsuckers once and for all. Callum questioned how they were going to kill the vampires. Arthur explained that it would take a Mordite weapon to stop their regeneration, or a targeted blow to the head or heart. However, they had no Mordite weapons, and the vampires were too fast to easily hit them with firearms. Jessica asked Callum again if he was willing to help. The boy confidently replied that he would bring Clara back, but he would need some things to prepare. Callum entered a soundproofed cell where he was escorted by Sheriff Arthur. It was the only safe place to concentrate on magic without fear of prying eyes. The boy asked to bring pillows. He needed them for the ritual. Arthur didn't understand what Callum was up to, but he gave him 5 minutes. Wells knew if he failed, he wouldn't be the only one in trouble, but also for the werewolves, as well as the entire guild of magical regulation. Besides, failure could lead to vampires brutalizing him. Meanwhile, the vampires' lair was quiet. They had not expected such decisive action from the werewolves, believing that they were constrained by their agreements with the guild. The mage in their midst assured them that her observation spell was still active and no one could approach unnoticed. But at that moment, a portal opened behind her. A silhouette with a shotgun appeared through it. A shot rang out. The mage dropped dead, her blood flooding the floor. Callum didn't hesitate. Using his space magic, he created portals right next to the vampires' heads and fired without showing himself. Each shot was accurate and deadly. He managed to use spatial intuition to find Clara. She was shackled, her magical energy almost fading, making it difficult to move. Despite this, Callum managed to carry her through the portal directly into the soundproof chamber. He immediately rushed towards her, making sure she was safe. Meanwhile, panic had broken out in the lair. The surviving vampires were trying to figure out where the attacks were coming from. But Callum continued methodically placing portals and destroying them one by one. His strength was rapidly running out, but he wasn't going to stop until all the enemies were dead. Outside the cell door, the sheriff and Jessica waited tensely. 346. After 45 seconds, without hearing a sound, they stepped inside and saw Clara. Jessica rushed to her sister, checking on her condition. The sheriff, on the other hand, was amazed that the situation had been resolved in such a short period of time. Callum declared that the vampires had been destroyed, but he advised sending firemen to the hotel where the fight had started a fire. Arthur looked at the boy carefully. Despite everything that had happened, he didn't sense the slightest trace of magical energy from Callum. Only later did he notice that Wells had used a magical amulet to hide his abilities. Callum headed to his car to leave, but Jessica caught up with him. She looked embarrassed, but thanked him profusely for saving Clara. Suddenly, she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, after which she quickly turned around and left. The sheriff returned to his werewolves and called Alpha Chester to report on the vampire problem. Chester was surprised that the werewolves hadn't intervened directly and demanded a detailed explanation. Arthur revealed that they had been helped by a strange guy whose real identity remained a mystery. The sheriff wasn't sure if Callum was a mage, a werewolf, or even a fairy, but his actions had saved the situation. Chester ordered Arthur to keep an eye on this mysterious stranger. If Callum was a mage, he could not be trusted. In any case, the werewolves remained indebted to him, even if they didn't yet know who he really was. The next day, Callum had been standing under the shower for half an hour, but he still couldn't get rid of the feeling of dirt. He remembered the dead bodies of the vampires over and over again. They were monsters, but still, living creatures that he had destroyed in cold blood. Why had it been so easy, and why was his conscience choking him now? He had just started learning magic, and he had already managed to deal with a whole gang of dangerous creatures. If he wanted to, he would become a villain that no one in the world could resist. Maybe the guild is right to put restrictions on mages? But then Clara would still be a prisoner in the hotel, Callum talked himself into believing he had done the right thing, but thoughts of the murdered vampires wouldn't let go. The flames of the fire that engulfed the hotel destroyed all evidence. But Langley remained. The sheriff knew too much. If Callum had been smarter, he would have pulled it off without the help of Jessica and the werewolves. Now he would have to leave Venuta, even though he had hoped to stay longer. Meanwhile, agents from the Magical Regulation Guild, Mage Ray Danforth and Faye Felixia Black, have shown up in town. Sheriff Arthur greeted them and hoped they would help sort out what had happened. When Ray asked about the situation at the hotel, the sheriff replied that his men were still searching the area, and several bodies had already been prepared for examination. At the morgue, Danforth scrutinized the bodies. The wounds were all identical, suggesting a professional killer. The sheriff assured the agents that it was not the work of werewolves and added that they did not understand exactly how the injuries had been inflicted. Felixia used magic to view the last moments of the dead men's lives. Her hands trembled slightly as the spell began to show scrappy images. The vampires didn't have time to realize what was killing them. One died in his sleep, the other didn't even hear the gunshot. Only one of them retained a panic picture of what was happening, but there was no clear information. Ray stated that the killer was very dangerous, and they would have to stay in town for a while to find out who it was. The sheriff offered to give them a room and added that none of the locals were capable of such an attack. The agents decided to figure out for themselves if the locals were connected to these events or if it was the work of an outsider. Callum, meanwhile, was examining the loot taken from the vampire's lair. The weapons included the usual pistols and shotguns, but the ammunition was unusual. Silverite, Mordite, and Corite were all suitable for destroying werewolves, vampires, and even fairies. He decided to save them for the future. Among the loot, there was also 100 grand in cash, gold bars, and some weird ceramic tiles. Callum figured they probably belonged to a mage, but he had no clue what they were for yet. All of it could come in handy, but the top priority right now was figuring out how to set up his defenses and prep for any threats. But his train of thought got cut off by the sound of a door opening. Someone was in the apartment. Callum froze, his heart racing. He couldn't believe it. Someone was already coming for him. Callum quickly hid all his trophies to keep them out of sight, and opened the door. On the threshold stood Jessica and Clara. They looked a little tense, but they were happy to see him. Jessica, not hiding her anxiety, asked if he was going to leave, for rumors of his disappearance had already begun to spread. Clara explained that they had come to warn him. Agents of the Guild of Magical Regulation had appeared in the city, and now they were actively investigating. Callum frowned, realizing that their visit had come much sooner than he had expected. Clara, oblivious to his reaction, ran over and hugged him, expressing her gratitude. She insisted that if it wasn't for him, she wouldn't be alive anymore. Callum, on the other hand, was cold and reminded them both that he hadn't been at the hotel and they should stick to that version. They also brought him food from their cafe, deciding that he could not safely visit their establishment. Callum reluctantly invited them into the house and asked them to tell him more about the agents. Clara reported that her father had seen them in the morning. One of the agents was rumored to be able to talk to the dead, but despite their efforts, nothing useful could be learned from the corpses. None of the vampires were able to pass on the information because their memories were too fuzzy. Callum listened intently, noting to himself that, thankfully, the agents hadn't gotten any key leads. Clara then mentioned the name of Alpha Chester, who happened to be the sheriff of Venuta. He was acting on behalf of the Midwest and helping werewolves, but was worried that his help might come at too high a price. Meanwhile, the guild agents wasted no time. Ray Danforth and Felixia Black discussed that the hotel fire looked extremely suspicious. The werewolf pack claimed to have nothing to do with it, but the agents suspected that the werewolves were hiding something. Using life magic, Ray Danforth saw scraps of visions that led her straight to Callum's house. Half an hour later, they were standing at his door. When Callum opened it, he immediately felt their power. They introduced themselves as agents of the Guild of Magical Regulation, showing their credentials. Callum tensed and realized that these two were much stronger than the vampires he had already defeated. Ray began the interrogation by asking what he knew about the hotel fire. Callum, remaining calm, parried that they said he could use a lawyer. However, Felixia interrupted him by pointing out that a lawyer would not be needed, which sounded like a threat. Danforth continued to press, asking if the sheriff had told him about the vampires that had recently appeared in town. Callum claimed to know nothing about it and assured him that he had only heard about the fire from the news. Ray, sighing, signaled a retreat, but lastly turned to him and, looking straight into his eyes, asked him not to leave the county. He was now one of the suspects. When they left, Callum was on the verge of panic. He realized that the agents had almost exposed him, and Felixia had even tried to use magic. One thing was clear to him: these two would not back down that easily. Callum, frightened by the agent's recent visit, realized it was time for him to run. He realized that resisting their magic made him the prime suspect. Wasting no time, he gathered all of his belongings, including his trophies, grabbed his shotgun, and got into his car. He realized that with each passing day, the Magic Regulation Guild would intensify its actions, and new agents would soon arrive in Venuta. Before leaving, Callum mentally apologized to Jessica and Clara, to whom he was grateful for their help and kindness. He wished he could have stayed in town longer, but right now his life hung in the balance. He realized that if anyone noticed his disappearance, the guild would immediately issue a warrant for his arrest. On the way out, Callum spotted a car with a for sale sign. It seemed like the perfect solution for him to get rid of his car, which could give him away. He went into the store to see who was selling the car. The salesman turned out to be a werewolf with the Langley family's magic signature, and he was interested when Callum placed a gold bar on the counter. He said he needed a new ID in this car. The salesman nodded, and 10 minutes later he handed Callum a fake ID in the name of Denver Brown, a professor, as the new ID indicated. Callum mentally noted that he would have to buy glasses to match the image. The clerk also recommended to Callum the Pearson bookstore on the corner of 5th and Main Streets, where books on magic could be found. Although there were few such books in town due to guild restrictions, Callum decided to visit the store the next day. It was too late now and he went back to his new car. Meanwhile, the salesman's thoughts were interrupted by a portal that suddenly appeared nearby. From it came a familiar voice apologizing for the intrusion. It was Callum, who had contacted Alpha Chester to relay the message. Clara's friend is safe. Chester, upon hearing this, ordered his pack to stop searching for Callum, calling him extremely dangerous. However, he was not about to let the matter go unanswered. Chester instructed Roy and John to find the man at all costs, using a trace of his magical energy. Meanwhile, the guild agents returned to Callum's house to continue their investigation. They knocked on the door, but no one opened. Ray Danforth, using magic, swung the doors open. Inside, they found that the house looked empty, as if no one had lived there for a long time. There was also nothing in the backyard. During their search, they found a strange metal bearing under the bed. It had a crude enchantment on it, but the metal itself retained no imprints of magic. This suggested that Callum was either a mage or worked with mages. If he's not a mage, he's definitely related to one, Felixia Black remarked, scrutinizing the find. Ray Danforth wondered what Alpha Langley might know about the bearing. He suggested that they put out a wanted notice for Callum's car and go to Langley for answers. Callum woke up in his car close to noon. After days of constant stress, this was his first night of sound sleep. However, he could not linger long. The agents of the Guild of Magical Regulation were getting closer by the hour. He hoped the werewolf from the store hadn't lied about the availability of useful books. He needed to know more about magic to continue hiding. The store he'd arrived at looked old and not particularly noteworthy. However, as soon as Callum stepped inside, he smelled dust and a slight magic signature. Despite the appearance of an ordinary bookstore, he surmised that there might be a secret department here. The salesman sitting behind the counter greeted him grudgingly and not too talkative. With no hope of help, Callum began to explore the shelves on his own. The assortment was disappointing. Half of the books were cheap fantasy and overpriced. Among them, however, he found a treatise on magical defenses, which seemed to him worthy of attention. Callum opened the book, but the seller immediately made a remark. Reading is possible only after the purchase. Taking advantage of the moment, Callum asked if there were any books for novice magicians. The salesman grinned, stating that he had no books for beginners, but upon learning that Callum was a professor, the salesman snapped his fingers lazily. Several books floated smoothly into the air with magic. Among them were a guide to focusing, an encyclopedia of magical houses, and a beginner's guide to portals. Callum purchased 4 books, paying over $1,000, but he left the store irritated. He had the feeling that he had been charged too much, and the salesman didn't even give him change. Meanwhile, the werewolves sent to find him continued their work. Callum's trail was faint, but still tangible. They found his car parked outside the store and noticed the security cameras. One of them suggested contacting an acquaintance to get the footage. However, they first decided to discuss it with Lucy, who was a professional at breaking and entering. In the meantime, Callum delved into reading. The books were of little use. There was very little information in them. The only thing he had learned was that the ceramic plates found in vampires were called tricks and made it easier to use complex spells. However, none of the books told how to make them or where to get them. Callum became more and more convinced that he should find another store, because his desire to learn was too strong. A day later, he even visited a fey shop that sold crystals and herbs, but he had no use for it. Besides, he still hadn't found anything about Dragonborn. The thought that Shahui might have been a unique creature never left him, nor did the memories of that disaster. During his search, he found another store. As soon as he entered, he was instantly enveloped by an incredible magical pressure. The energy emanating from the girl standing by the shelf was so strong that Callum's breath was taken away. He couldn't take his eyes off her, trying to figure out who she was. Lucy concentrated on hacking into the security cameras with Alpha Chester. She noted that his men had called for help in time, as she had found it easy to work with the surveillance systems. Chester inquired if she'd been able to locate their target. Lucy confirmed that locating it had been easy. Street cameras had picked him up a couple hours ago, and she already knew his current location. However, she noticed that their methods left a lot to be desired. If his guys continued to just track his movements, they would always stay one step behind. Instead, she thought it was worth asking not where he was, but where he was going. Lucy recalled that his men had already done much of the work, questioning the shopkeepers and store owners where he was staying. Apparently, this man was showing too much interest in books. Further observations of cameras on major exits out of the state confirmed her hunch. He was heading south. She shared the results with Chester, adding that Roy had compiled a list of likely stopping places. Apparently, Professor Denver Brown was now in yet another bookstore owned by a werewolf. Chester, thinking about it, asked him to tell his people not to make contact. He wanted Mr. Brown to come to them himself, not the other way around. Lucy smiled, pleased that the chief finally understood her logic. The protagonist puzzled over what was happening. His thoughts were confused. Should he have messed with Alpha Chester? It seemed crazy, but deep down he realized that there was no other way out. If Chester was close, then his stealth strategy was cracking at the seams. A phone call could clarify the situation and perhaps indicate the next step. In the phone booth, Callum decided to dial the number after all. To his surprise, the connection was established quickly. Alpha seemed to be waiting for his call. He greeted Mr. Brown cordially, but insisted on addressing him as Mr. Hall. Gritting his teeth, Callum asked bluntly what was wanted of him. The chief reminded him of his debt for saving Clara and added that Vinnet was far from the only place where vampires were wreaking havoc. Callum, coldly stating that he wasn't a mercenary, still froze when he heard about the reward. Alpha promised not money but information, access to the data of the Magical Regulation Guild. Such a gift was more valuable than gold, especially for someone trying to survive in the magical world. Moreover, Chester offered to arrange a meeting with a magical expert if Callum accepted his terms. Holding back his irritation, Callum asked what was required in return. Chester explained that the 4 cities were under threat. The vampires had cleverly circumvented the political rules to undermine his influence. Defending all 4 locations seemed an impossible task. Callum wasn't sure he could repeat his trick with the vampires, especially after he'd almost been caught by guild agents last time. The chief noted that time was short and suggested he pass on the details in a note. At Callum's question about how he'd managed to find him, Chester calmly explained that his men had tracked the scent and then checked against a pattern. His love of bookstores made him predictable. That there was a dumpster on the next street where the werewolves had left a data folder. There was detailed information about the vampires and the upcoming mission. Back in the car, he took a quick flip through the contents. It was like a full-fledged encyclopedia. The distance between some of these cities was over 1,300 kilometers, making the task almost impossible. However, Callum had an idea. If he could use magic to teleport, even if only for short distances, it would give him an advantage. Callum pondered his next move. He had the power of gravity, an ability that could theoretically give incredible movement speed. The problem was that he had never used it to fly. Risky, but there was no choice. Tensing up, he concentrated to gather magical energy around him. The magic swirled in a vortex, lifting him into the air. For the first few seconds, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. But suddenly the power spun out of control. He was violently thrown backwards and crashed into a tree with a crash. The blow was painful, but not fatal. Callum stood up, realizing that without stabilization, this skill was more of a liability than an advantage. However, the idea of a solution to the problem was already looming in his mind. The agents of the Guild of Magical Regulation were methodically scouring the area. Their attention was drawn to the ravine, where one of them noticed something unusual. A car was hidden under a layer of camouflage branches. Felicia Black looked inside. The interior was perfectly cleaned, no trace of anything. But the condition of the shelter and the fresh tracks on the ground spoke clearly. The target was very close. Callum found the motorcycle, and reinforcing it with magic, rushed forward with unimaginable speed. Gravitational magic made transportation almost elusive, allowing him to cover distances in a matter of minutes. Having solved the transportation issue, he headed towards one of the vampire nests. Half an hour later, he reached the location. Alpha Chester provided contacts for the local alphas, but Callum decided to go it alone to avoid unnecessary risks. He activated his magical gaze, trying to locate the target. A local movie theater caught his attention. The building's magical aura literally screamed the presence of vampires. Callum counted 9 vampires and 1 earth mage. Magical shields protected the building, but they appeared to extend only to the interior. Bypassing the defenses from the outside was easy, but getting inside without attracting attention seemed a challenge. The vampires were a particular danger. Their speed and strength surpassed anything he had seen before. His musings were interrupted by a shocking new fact. Inside the building, he noticed the 10th vampire carrying the body of a little girl in his arms. Fury flared in Callum's chest. Vampires and their mage allies disgusted him. He swore they would pay for it. Gritting his teeth, he decided to contact Alpha Chester and agreed to his offer. He needed a strategy, quick, precise, and undetectable to the agents of the Magic Regulation Guild. His thoughts were distracted by a reminder of meeting Gale, the mage girl he'd recently met at the bookstore. They had been studying magic plates together, and this time she had succeeded. Gale, channeling magic into the plate, was able to make the book fly. The success inspired them both, and they agreed to continue the class the following week. Callum looked over his supplies and thought over the plan. He had a nest of vampires to destroy, and he already knew how to do it quickly and efficiently. Tomorrow these monsters should be gone. Callum didn't want a repeat of the hotel, so he refused to use the guns. However, he had a better plan. Termite. It is a mixture of metal oxide and aluminum, often used for welding rails. When ignited, it burns at over 2,000 degrees Celsius, twice as hot as a glowing light bulb. It's just what you need to melt the skin of vampires. Thermite can even be made from improvised materials. For this purpose, it is enough to collect rust from the pipe, shred aluminum foil, and mix the components in a ratio of 3:1. Pour the mixture into a soda can, and behold, the homemade grenade is ready. Callum had already made over 100 of these grenades, and it seemed to him that this was enough. He would put them in hiding places so that he wouldn't have to carry them all at once. Now he had to find a heavy object for the next stage. Looking around, he spotted a rock that fit perfectly. Two vampires sitting in a movie theater were discussing the movie, thinking it was terrible. Suddenly a portal opened near them and a bomb fell. A second later, there was a huge explosion and the vampires were engulfed in flames. The other vampires, hearing the strange sound, reacted quickly. But at that moment, an alarm went off in the movie theater, and water flowed from the ceiling. However, the nightmare did not end there. A portal appeared above the head of one of the vampires again, and another bomb fell out of it. As it exploded, it destroyed several more vampires nearby. Callum was pleased with how it had worked, but he wasn't going to stop. He continued to teleport the explosive cans, fighting the vampires at lightning speed, not giving them a second to react. The Archmage jumped out into the corridor and watched the flames consume everything around him. Callum wasn't going to waste any time thinking about it. He knew it was time for the second phase. The only thing he didn't know was how powerful the mage's shields were. Thermite and bullets were unlikely to penetrate such a protective barrier, so Callum had another plan. He enchanted a stone and used telekinesis to lift it into the air. The mage, like all humans, could not be forever prepared for the unexpected. When the stone reached the right height, Callum created the portal at the last moment. So the boulder, almost landing, struck with such force that no shield could withstand it. The rock crushed the Archmage. Callum knew the nest was finished. He headed for the motorcycle, and an hour later was at the next one. A huge flaming building greeted him with the sight of dying vampires. There was no chance of survival for them. Meanwhile, the werewolves watched the results and the reaction of the vampires, but Callum seemed to have done everything cleanly. His actions left no trace. At that moment, his phone vibrated. Another nest, destroyed. Alpha Chester didn't see how it was possible, but Callum had already set up for the third goal. He used his penetrating gaze and counted a dozen vampires and one well-defended mage there. But there was someone else. Two humans, ordinary, without any supernatural powers. Callum didn't know how to take them out without revealing himself. Callum paced back and forth nervously, trying to figure out how to get the ordinary people out of the nest. Saving them meant revealing his identity, but leaving them behind would be unbearable. He realized that if he saved them, he would need to hide them in a safe place where enemies couldn't get to them quickly. A couple blocks away, he spotted a fast food cafe, so he decided he would leave them there. But first, this nest had to be destroyed. There was no time to wait. He quickly analyzed the building, finding a few weak spots where vampires were gathering in clumps, or where there was something easily flammable. He was confident in his plan. 6 cans of thermite and a drop of portal ointment was enough. Callum opened the portal and began sending bombs to key points. Within seconds, the buildings were on fire and explosions shook everything around them. The kidnapped people, upon hearing this, became frightened. The fire alarm went off and the fire engulfed everything. They had to get out immediately. At that moment, a large portal appeared behind them. Callum put on his mask and wondered if they were all right. He told them to face forward, close their eyes, and trust him. He would lead them out of here. They did not know what to do, but following his instructions, they closed their eyes. The portal opened, and they found themselves in the restroom. He told them to wait until things calmed down. The girl asked if he was leaving because they still didn't know who he was. Callum replied that his name was Nobody and told them to forget his face and voice. He was not going to answer any unnecessary questions. He promised that Alpha Chester would take care of them later. They would be safe. As he walked, he got a message that the vampires were starting to leave en masse. The 4th nest had been disbanded. He could finally exhale. Even though Callum had trained for a long time, his strength was still running low. If he had to defend another nest, he wouldn't last. But it was all worth it, not just for the deal with Alpha Chester, but so that the two men could get on with their lives. The chief was confused. How had he managed to pull all this off? If he had access to the Magic Regulation Guild's teleportation network, that was one thing. But if he didn't, then it was the Fae's doing. Jasper assumed that their magic was different from his, and full of secrets. Lucy figured out that he hardly ever uses his phone and tried to track him down but was unsuccessful, so she was out of ideas this time. The chief wondered, if he could move his men as fast, it would be very convenient. But Jasper doubted that he would reveal his secrets to them. Chester then suggested that perhaps they should offer him something in return. Not just a conversation with Jasper, but something much more valuable. Lucy wasn't sure if he had someone working as a scout on his staff, but she'd be happy to be at his side. Chester, on the other hand, understood what she meant, becoming a volunteer. But he thought it was something he should avoid if he were her, given her relationship with the guild. Lucy assured him that she could work for the guild after all. They didn't care about non-mages like her. Let them consider it a done deal. But suddenly the phone rang. Chester picked it up and it was Antoine on the line. He told him to recall his men. These targeted attacks on nests violate the agreement, and the guild will not let it go unchecked. Chester replied that he had no idea what he was talking about. None of his werewolves had even approached the nests. Antoine insisted that Chester get the men off his property, or he would have to intervene. Chester, breathing out in relief, said he was glad to hear that. However, the vampire warned that he wouldn't leave it at that. For now, he didn't know who Chester had hired to deal with him, but when he found them, they would wish the guild had gotten to them first. Agents investigated a fire at a movie theater where a vampire nest was destroyed. Bearings were found on the floor, a trail pointing to the attacker. Ray Danforth was sure it was the work of the same person who had previously destroyed another nest. The methods differed, but the style remained the same. The suspect was becoming more and more dangerous. Felicia Black suggested that the first attack may have been spontaneous, but new evidence pointed to a carefully planned operation. Ray noted that the attack resembled a professional ambush and suggested talking to Alpha Chester, since all the incidents occurred on its property. If Chester didn't have answers, that left Antoine Levine and Raveb, key figures who could be connected to the case. Ray Danforth noted that the Fae might have valuable information because of their unique style of killing. Meanwhile, Alpha Chester greeted the agents and invited them to sit down. He stated that he was aware of the tragedy at the Avalanche Vampire Nest, but assured that he had nothing to do with it. He said he would prefer to resolve any disagreements with Lavin through the Magical Regulation Guild. Ray, however, took his words as memorized excuses. Chester started to answer their questions, but the conversation was interrupted by a phone call. Alpha apologized and stepped back to talk. It was Callum, who irritatedly remarked that Chester had quickly ended their previous conversation. Callum, wasting no time, separated and hid the loot from the vampires' nests, in 5 locations accessible only through teleportation, to eliminate the possibility of it being captured. Chester soon called back and reported that the agents were unhappy with his lack of specific information about the attacker, but they had no real leads. Alpha warned Callum that if he was suddenly identified, he would no longer be able to protect him. He then moved on to the issue of payment. Chester introduced Callum to the 2 men. The first, Harry, a magical expert, offered to help him study mages and provide information from grimoires. The second, an information technology specialist, called herself Monotoshka. She stated that she had already secured their conversations against wiretapping and offered Callum her technical support. Callum agreed to take her contact for reflection, although he did not trust her completely. Finally, Chester warned Callum about the danger of Antoine Levine, the Minneapolis host, calling him the most vicious and dangerous vampire he knew. Chester brought Callum rare grimoires, handwritten with detailed descriptions. However, despite their value, there was little mention of spatial magic in them, in that Callum learned nothing new. When evening came, he decided to contact Monotoshka to discuss her proposal. The girl answered the call with enthusiasm, assuming that Callum was interested in her services. He clarified how much it would cost him, and Monotoshka offered to send the price list on which she works with Chester. However, according to her, everything depends on the task. The more interesting the work, the cheaper it can cost. After all, most of her orders from the world of the supernatural turn out to be boring and monotonous. Callum wondered if she was a werewolf, but Monotoshka dispelled his doubts. She revealed that she was an ordinary human, although her parents were mages. She was unlucky enough to inherit their abilities. Monotoshka also admitted that she was tired of her nickname Monotoshka and sent Callum a message with a price list, where she indicated her real name, Lucille Harper. She admitted that if Chester didn't protect her, the Magical Regulation Guild would easily recognize her real name and find her. Callum questioned whether she could really trust Chester, considering how much he needed help himself. He decided that, despite her competence, he should only risk it as a last resort. Lucy agreed with Callum's musings. She added that Alpha Chester, despite his influence, was virtually untouchable. He could manipulate dozens of people, and the most serious punishment for him is only a formal reprimand. According to her, only the Archmages or the head of the vampires can stand on equal footing with him. Callum realized that it seems Antoine Levin is indeed extremely dangerous. He had not paid much attention to Chester's warnings earlier, but now he realized that this vampire was a figure on the scale of the Archmages. He asked Lucy to find out what had become of the couple he had rescued from the vampire's nest and left at the fast food place. She checked the data and reported that they had been discovered by agents of the Magical Regulation Guild. Callum was angry with himself, realizing that he should have taken care of their safety himself. Lucy offered to look into the details, but reminded him of the fee for his services. Callum offered to leave 2 kilograms of enchanted gold in the stash. which Lucy thought was an excellent reward. The next day, Callum met with his apprentice Gale. She practiced spells, honing her skills, and demonstrated success in telekinesis. Gale wondered how the professor knew about this spell, since she had been unable to handle light spells for a long time. Callum replied that it was thanks to the advice of an acquaintance of his. The girl asked to convey her thanks and added that the spell worked perfectly. Callum asked her about her progress in learning attack spells. Gale said that by experimenting with energy inversion, she was able to damage insects using an asymmetrical magic system. But her story was getting more and more complicated, and Callum felt uncomfortable. He realized how quickly trained mages were able to learn new knowledge, unlike himself. Meanwhile, an important meeting was taking place elsewhere. Alpha Chester, leader of the werewolves of the Midwest, was awaiting the appearance of Antoine Lavin, head of the vampires. When Lavin finally showed up, the tension between them was evident. Lavin sharply lambasted Chester for his impertinent remarks, calling him a mongrel. The two could hardly contain their mutual dislike. The conversation was interrupted by Raveb, the fairy king of the Midwest. He demanded to get down to business. Archmagus John Rhee, representative of the Guild of Magical Regulation, opened the meeting. He announced that an assassin was operating in their lands, and emphasized that all parties needed to come together to solve the problem. Callum decided to return to Vinet to check on his home. To his surprise, the house appeared to be in perfect order, and the guild agents had not touched it. He assumed this was a credit to the Langley family, who probably thought he might return here and took care of it. He pulled out the caches of gold and money. Everything was safe. Taking as much as he could carry, he left some in the house, expecting it would come in handy in the future. Callum realized that expenses were mounting, especially with the hiring of Lucy and the purchases of magical artifacts. Determined to act quickly, he planned to leave the city without further encounters. Before leaving, however, Callum didn't hold back, and headed for Langley's house to make sure they were all right. Using spatial vision, he saw that the whole family was in the cafe. Arthur was having a conversation with Jessica, and Clara looked happy, although the nightmares still plagued her. Jessica reflected that because of the vampire's spell, she remembered almost nothing, although the aftermath could still leave a mark. They discussed how lucky they were to have Clara back thanks to Callum. Suddenly, the sound of a roaring engine outside caught the family's attention. Jessica ran out into the yard and spotted the motorcyclist, but couldn't recognize him as Callum. He realized he was in danger of being seen. To keep Langley safe, Callum decided to stay away from them. It became clear to him, if he stayed close, the guild agents would find them sooner or later. Later, Callum discussed teleportation circles with Lucy. She was surprised that he still didn't know where they were, given that the guild uses them extensively. Lucy agreed to send a list of public circles, but noted that it was difficult to access the private circles of families. Callum learned that the guild can use the circles to travel hundreds of kilometers, which put him at a disadvantage with his limited teleportation of 150 meters. One of those circles, according to Lucy, was in a mattress store, magic lurking right under people's noses. Callum realized that the guild guarded their circles carefully and would have to proceed with caution. His teleportation magic left a signature that could be tracked, but usually managed to dissipate before agents got to him. However, Callum remembered that Jessica had been able to detect his scent immediately after using the magic. Deciding that improved teleportation was the key to his survival, he began to analyze the circle. Hiding behind a tree, he activated his spatial gaze and discovered a portal. However, the distance prevented him from seeing the details. Realizing that such circles are usually created with complex magical designs, Callum began to draw a blueprint. He needed to get closer to find out how these circles worked and how the guild ensured their effectiveness. When the blueprint was ready, Callum activated his own portal and stepped forward, preparing for new discoveries. The negotiations between Chester and the vampire continued. Chester asked if Antoine Lavin believed the assassin existed, but the vampire was adamant that the assassin existed and was working for the werewolves. Alpha Chester categorically denied such allegations. But Lavin did not hold back and demanded that Archmagus Janry publicly denounce Chester, who, in his opinion, brought nothing constructive to the discussion. Raveb, a representative of the fairies, intervened, saying that there could be no discussion here and that vampires were only creating unnecessary hysteria. He hoped they were not so reckless as to accuse their people without reason. Archmagus Janry intervened, explaining that the investigation into the attacks on vampire nests was ongoing, and suspicions of werewolves had been dropped. The meeting had been called not to aggravate the feud, but to discuss the existence of a dangerous killer. Although the attacks were directed only at vampires, Janry emphasized that this did not guarantee that other races would not be affected in the future. The guild considered the killer a threat to all creatures under their protection, and if werewolves were not involved, there must be other leads. With a slight strain, Janry pulled a bearing from his pocket and asked if it was familiar to anyone present. Meanwhile, Callum wondered about Gale. If she's from such a family, she's probably using teleportation. In order to get to his classes, she's clearly not someone who uses public transportation. He checked the information Lucy had sent him and realized that the nearest circle connected to the bookstore was here. He stopped at the jewelry store. He looked at the circle, which looked just like the one he had seen before. He decided to try to copy it and wire the circle into a computer-aided design system to create a layout. But for a quality reproduction, he had to get closer and study the details of the portal. Suddenly, he felt magic and realized that someone was approaching. It must be her. The magic from the circle was creating a path directly to the girl, and he noticed the magic wrapped around his arm. It was interesting. The circle seemed to be reacting to her tattoo in some way. A lot of things were clear now. If the magic tattoo was unique to each mage, then it must open up access to using the circle. This allowed the guild to keep track of where a mage entered the portal and where they exited. Given their desire to control everything, this didn't surprise Callum. If only he could get closer and scrutinize the portal, it would be easier for him to understand how everything worked. A little later, Gale entered the store and asked the clerk if he had seen Professor Brown. She was surprised because he usually came in before her. The professor explained that he had been fiddling with his books for a long time, but the girl already thought she might have been forgotten. A little later, Callum might have been caught. He dropped his bearing near the books, watching Gale passionately. He had completely forgotten that she was supposed to come to his class. The girl wanted to learn more about movement magic, which was proving to be quite a difficult subject, especially since healing magic had almost nothing to do with movement magic. If it was elemental magic, many of the requirements would be much easier. Callum remembered how he himself was starting to get frustrated when learning how to create spatial orbs. Gale asked if he knew any spells from movement magic. Callum, as if anticipating the question, replied that he knew the basics of gravity magic. However, if a real mage saw him, he would immediately suspect his incomplete competence. Callum worried that if she realized that he couldn't do what he should be able to do, his identity might be revealed. The girl inquired if she could see a spell. Callum agreed to demonstrate something. He changed the gravity of the chair and it began to take off a little. It was simple levitation, but far from all he knew how to do. If he had rested a bit, he could have demonstrated something more impressive. Gale was interested and asked if it could be learned. Callum promised that he would try his best. He felt that he was succeeding in playing his part better than he had expected. However, in the middle of the conversation, his phone suddenly rang. It was Lucy. She said she had news about the two people he was inquiring about. Things are a little confusing, but the guild has a clear set of rules. One that holds those who bring ordinary people into the magical world accountable. So Callum was responsible for these people. Even though he had saved them, the vampires were the first to act, and now they were going to take them back. Callum couldn't believe that they were going to hand the victims back to the killers. It was ridiculous. But for the guild, the most important thing was to follow the rules. He was agitated and demanded information from Lucy about the locations and names of vampires and guild agents. At the same time, he began to create a portal. Lucy realized what he was up to and warned him that if he planned an attack on the guild, it would be extremely dangerous. But Callum was determined and ordered the names to be called. To the average passerby, the place seemed like an unremarkable business center. But behind the glossy facade and video surveillance system was the headquarters of the Kansas City Magical Regulation Guild. The hero, finding himself in front of the building, thought about further actions. He asked for the names and locations of all the department's vampire agents to be given to him. Lucy, upon receiving this request, noted doubtfully that it was risky even for her. She realized that the hero was furious, but assured him that she was on his side. His plan to attack the guild headquarters seemed suicidal to her. Callum couldn't just abandon innocent people to their fate. He felt guilty for what had happened. If he had brought them elsewhere, the tragedy would not have happened. Now, to protect his interests, he had to put things right. Lucy advised him to prioritize. She reminded him of the people who would be left in danger if he died. Asked him not to abandon everything he was working on because of one bad day. The hero agreed with her reasoning, but insisted on getting a list of agents. The more he knew, the better he could plan his actions. Lucy promised to do her best, but warned him to be careful. Remembering this conversation, the hero realized that he would have to thank Lucy for her support. However, he needed to strengthen his magical abilities before challenging the guild. He vowed that sooner or later they would answer for all their crimes. The next day, Jasper asked the hero a strange question. Why was he so interested in young mages? He knew about children showing magical abilities early, but he was also interested in the opposite cases. What could prevent the development of magic in childhood? Jasper, not being a doctor, suggested that it might be due to a lack of mana or other factors. He noted that any child growing up in a magical environment would be literally bathed in vis. Hence, if a child grew up outside of a magical environment, his powers may simply not have unfolded. Jasper had never encountered such a case, but thought it logical. The hero remembered using magic during the attack on the fitness club. That was probably when he first felt a surge of vis, considering his parents were clearly not magicians. He had always wondered what it was like to grow up in a family of mages. Jasper jokingly suggested that the hero might have a secret child. Callum replied that if he did, he wouldn't have mentioned it, and thanked him for his help. The hero then spoke to Lucy. He asked if it was true that everyone in her family was a mage except her. Lucy confirmed this, explaining that this is why the guild uses her as a messenger. They didn't know what to do with a regular person, so they sent her to the IT department. She asked about his family. The hero remembered that Jasper had asked him similar questions before, and he began to think that Chester was trying to elicit information from him. However, he didn't blame them for their curiosity. He was a mysterious figure, and everyone wanted to know more about him. Callum evasively replied that his private life was not interesting, but perhaps he would reveal something someday. Lucy took the opportunity to suggest that they swap stories on their first date. The hero replied that he didn't know if he was ready to open up. They said their goodbyes. Hero went to see his student, Gail. She complained about the boring textbooks. She grabbed the professor's hand and said she owed him now. He had helped her with a lot of things. He had one request. He was looking for new ways to move. The guild's teleportation circles worked well, but he wanted to find something more compact. Gail remembered her father using a home bond and offered to show him. Hero agreed. The friend who lent him the textbooks had several theories he wanted to explore. Gail suggested that one of them involved teleportation, and asked if his friend happened to be a spatial wizard. She warned that divulging such information without the wizard's knowledge could have serious consequences. The guild keeps a close eye on spatial magic, and rumor has it that if Archmage Duval finds out about this, no one will ever see this mage again. Gail promises Callum to discuss with his father the possibility of bringing Homebond in for research. The idea of using a portable means of transportation seemed logical. After all, the guild's teleportation circles were tedious. She had no doubt that the professor knew what he was doing. After all, he was a professional. Suddenly, an assistant approached her and asked if Gail was going home. The girl asked to be escorted to a private teleportation network. Upon entering the office, Gail noticed that all the portals were busy, which was highly unusual for a private network. The assistant explained that something had caused the guild to become more active in recent days, which caused a lot of mages to pass through the portals. Gail teleported home, where she was met by the butler Jemison. Although she liked her study partner, she couldn't get rid of the thought that some of the demands on her were absurd. Jemison reminded her that her high expectations were justified, for she was the future of their family. Later, Gail spoke with her father, who set aside time to rest from his duties. He told her that there was tension in the guild over a vampire hunter, and the archmages are arguing about how to solve the problem. Gail was a little scared when she heard about the hunter. The girl mentioned that her grandfather, Archmage Hargrave, might stop by tonight, and she needs to get ready. In conversation, she asked her father for permission to take Homebond for her study group to research. Her father explained that this artifact is only available to archmages and was created by Duval herself. But for Gail's sake, he agreed, asking that the device not be activated. A week later, Gail met with Callum and handed him the Homebond. The professor, upon examining the device, realized that it was encrypted and only responded to her father's mark. However, thanks to his spatial sense, Callum was able to discern hidden layers of enchantment. He realized that the working principle of the artifact was complex, but believed he could replicate it in time. Meanwhile, the guild agents continued their search for the vampire hunter, but again reached a dead end. Interrogations of werewolves, fairies, and vampires yielded no results. Investigator Ray Danforth suggested that the perpetrator would make a mistake sooner or later. His actions, in Ray's opinion, may have been related to protecting someone close to him. Felicia Black added that the hunter likely has accomplices. If one of them stumbled, it would reveal their plans. After several failed attempts using laser engraving, he finally finished the job. If it works, he'll have a real working Homebond in his hands. All that remained was to fill the ring with vis. Once the ring was charged, it activated, teleporting him straight into the bathtub. It landed with a clatter. The guy realized that the landing still needed some work, but it was a definite success. It only took a couple days to develop the device. He began by realizing that spatial magic was much more complex and extensive than it was presented in the guild. Archmage Duvala carefully controls the space mages, keeping them under strict supervision. Because the other mages do not fully understand how space magic works, Duvala easily increases his influence over the guild. All of this meant that the guy was in much more danger than he had imagined. Any criminal mage is a problem, but what if such a mage uncovered Archmage Duvala's entire scheme? He would become the biggest threat imaginable to the guild. Meanwhile, the apprentice has figured out how to work the plate. Hoping for success, she focused, channeled her magic, and concentrated. Power began to emanate from the circle. It may not be the most effective shield, but it should be enough to pass the test. It was a success, and the girl was glad. She offered to come back next week and talk about the results. If the teachers needed more, she would ask for help again. At this point, she noticed a bruise on the boy's arm and asked if he was okay. Callum was surprised to remember that he might have bumped himself while teleporting into the bathtub. Gail offered to heal the wound, as it wouldn't be a problem for her. He had helped her so much, it was the least she could do for him. She touched the wound using magic, and the wound began to heal. After saying goodbye, she said she had to go sign up for her exam before everything slipped her mind. Suddenly, Callum grabbed her arm and asked her not to let anyone belittle her. Equal sign he believed in her strength. She thanked him for his support. The next day, Gail took an exam. Another professor suggested starting in order. Her school records showed that she shouldn't have any problems with healing, so they could skip this item. Next on the list was light. She concentrated and released the balls of light from her hands, then demonstrated movement magic by flying into the air. Upon landing, she concentrated magic around herself, showing a shield. The examiner thought everything was great and suggested moving on to attack spells. The girl had practiced this, but was a little worried. She directed the power from her hands to the figure and released the magic. After a few seconds, the figure cracked from the inside. She was very proud of herself and began to rejoice. She explained to the examiner that it was a healing attack, creating blood clotting in the body. The professor wrote something down and, noticing her excitement, assured her that everything was fine. But he needed to check something. 4 hours later, when her patience had run out, the agents of the Magic Regulation Guild entered the room. Frightened, she asked if she had failed the test. Ray Danforth replied that it was out of his area of expertise, but he was extremely interested in her healing attack. When asked if she had come up with it herself, the girl replied that she had not. Some Professor Brown gave her a way to disrupt the processes inside her body and directed her to the necessary research. Danforth then stated that there could be serious problems with this and demanded to be told everything she knew about Professor Brown. Callum contacted Lucy, who reported that the guild was annoyed at the unsuccessful search for the elusive killer. Many vampires lay low, fearing more attacks. However, nothing had happened in weeks and tensions had subsided. Callum asked about the Hargrave house. Lucy couldn't believe he wanted to contact them. It transpired that Callum had met a girl called Gail and was interested in her background. Lucy ran Gail through the database. 22 years old, a mage with powers. Information about her family turned out to be disturbing. House Hargrave is one of the most dangerous and ancient. They invented many attack spells. Archmage Hargrave personally defined the concept of battle magic and is very powerful in battle. However, Gail is a healer, which indicated possible incest. Callum assumed that one of the Hargraves had an affair with a healer, and thus Gail was born. Perhaps they wanted to create a new talent, which made Gail a valuable asset. If anyone interfered with her, the Hargraves wouldn't be happy. These are not people to mess with. If he touches Gail, no one will be able to protect him. Callum thanked Lucy for the warning. Now the situation was even more dangerous. He wondered if he should skip the last meeting with Gail, but a sudden disappearance would arouse suspicion. He decided to show up, say goodbye, and then go into hiding. Meanwhile, the guild agents were on full alert. Felicia Black wondered if too much effort was being thrown into catching one murderer. Archimagus Hargrave could single-handedly destroy the city. When the Archmage learned that his granddaughter was being manipulated, he insisted on participating in the operation. Agents discovered a potential target, a gravity wizard. He teleported away, eluding them. But he was spotted outside the store again. Ray ordered him to be captured. Team A issued a bracelet blocking magic. The magician tried to escape, but the bracelet clung to his arm. He fell, feeling the energy being drained out of him. Golden clots of magic bound his body. The team reported the capture of the target. Suddenly there was thunder and lightning, and the Archmage, Father Gale, appeared. He demanded that the one who had dared to touch his granddaughter be handed over to him. Ray tried to explain that they were investigating, and the detainee would not escape. The Archmage demanded to be kept informed. Ray ordered the detainee to be searched. One of the soldiers found a ball bearing. A picture formed in Ray Danforth's mind. It looked like they had found a vampire killer. A few hours later, Callum came to his senses in an unknown room. After looking around, he realized that it was an interrogation room where he had been before. His hands were handcuffed and he could not understand what had happened. All he remembered was heading to meet Gale, and then he was suddenly surrounded by men in suits. He regretted not teleporting away as soon as he sensed the other mage's presence. Soon the door opened and the guild agents, Ray Danforth and Felicia Black, entered the room. They called out his real name, Callum Wells. Callum realized that his identity was now revealed. One part of the guild was looking for a dimensional mage, the other for a skilled assassin. But no one even suggested that it could be the same person. The agents made it clear that they had questions for him. Felicia activated her magic, forcing the truth, and asked if he was involved in destroying the vampire nest in Venuta. Callum was outraged. What made them think he had anything to do with it? Ray explained that the ball bearings he'd used in the battle had given him away, but they were more interested in his motivation. Callum dryly replied that the vampires that had been killed were killing humans. Felicia, however, parried that this was no excuse. This infuriated the mage. He pounded his fist on the table, stating that the real problem was not why he was killing, but why the guild was doing nothing. Felicia asked who he was working for. Callum replied that he had always worked only for himself, as he didn't like to obey. Ray found this amusing, noting that in other circumstances they could probably get along. But now Callum was a criminal, and he would be severely punished. The agents then mentioned his interaction with Gale. It turned out that the Bureau suspected him of teaching her illegal techniques. Callum assured her he was only teaching her the basics. But Felicia insisted that his knowledge could have ruined her future. He tried to explain that it was all basic biochemistry available to any doctor. However, the agents accused him of perverting magic with his human approach. When the conversation got heated and they started yelling at each other, the bracelet on his arm activated and electrocuted him to calm him down. Felicia asked again if he was trying to recruit Gale. Callum brushed it off, explaining that he just wanted to help her, as he saw her desire for knowledge. But the agents felt he was using her for his own ends. Unexpectedly, Callum claimed he was stalling for time. Ray didn't understand what this was about, as all the enchantments in the room were blocked. However, magic began to gather around the mage. It turned out that he had hidden the enchanted ring inside his own body beforehand, where no one would be able to detect it. Before the agents could react, Callum activated the portal and disappeared, saying goodbye to them. Ray immediately declared a level 4 alert, requesting that all available agents be brought in. Meanwhile, Callum was already speeding away on his motorcycle, leaving the city at top speed. Felicia Black recalled that they had checked Callum for home bond, but found nothing. Apparently, the artifact had been implanted in him, which was an extremely rare occurrence. She wondered who could have done it, since only Archmage Duval made such items, and she already had an endless stream of orders. Perhaps someone else had learned how to do it, but that was unlikely. Felicia suggested tracking Callum with a spell that works on his blood, but it only covers 15 kilometers, and the guy's probably already far away. She realized that this was complicating things, and Duval would be extremely unhappy. Equal sign, Duval was really pissed off. She found out that the spatial mage was in custody, but she wasn't even notified, even though, as an archmage, she had the right to be. She swore that those who withheld information from her would be held accountable. Agent Jean tried to reassure her, reminding her that the bigger issue now was the forbidden magic that Callum was involved with. Duvalet explained why healing magic in the wrong hands is so dangerous. If used aggressively, it can bypass any mage's defenses. Furthermore, Gail Hargrave, having learned the technique, is now a threat. Her grandfather could still save her reputation, but if it wasn't for him, she would already be listed as a criminal mage. Agent Jean asked if Duvalet could provide more information about Callum. The Archmage said that spatial magic is the most peaceful of all, but still, she needs to know who trained him and his background, since such mages are born once every 30, 40 years. She insisted on catching him. In the meantime, Callum had acted. He had necessary items in advance all over the state: clothes, weapons, cash, and even textbooks. Now he had everything he needed to start over. But he realized he had made a mistake in allowing his identity to be revealed. Callum decided to contact Lucy to make sure she was all right. She assured him that there was no problem and told him that she had managed to get her hands on the research material. Callum asked if she could tell him where to find magical equipment, preferably not disposable. Lucy explained that such things were strictly regulated, but if you sneak into worlds through portals, you might find something useful. Taking artifacts on his own was illegal, but given his status, it didn't matter anymore. Lucy also warned that Archmage Duval was furious. She is the spatial archmage and controls all other mages in that area. If she catches him, he won't be happy. By that night, Callum was nearing the border of Fey territory. Lucy gave him data about them. Fairies have magic that is completely incomprehensible to ordinary mages. While their abilities are varied, they are not particularly powerful. Suddenly, Callum felt the presence of a group of beings. They were not human beings. He encountered dryads, pixies and fairies adorned with necklaces on which hung human ears. Meanwhile, in the forest, several ordinary people, fleeing from monsters, lost their way. They tried their best to move faster, but a girl named Hannah stopped, exhausted beyond belief. The guy accompanying her explained that they couldn't stop. Their pursuers were already breathing down their backs. The guy made it clear that stopping meant death, just as it did for those who couldn't escape earlier. Meanwhile, Callum remembered an episode from his childhood. He then asked his father to let him play on the slide. He was allowed, but his father warned him that he must stay in plain sight. Callum rode until he noticed the two boys starting to fight. One argued that it was his part of the playground and that he should ask permission before entering. The other objected that the place was shared. The first boy ended up pushing the second boy, calling him a loser. Callum continued playing, thinking it was none of his business. But then his father came up and asked why he didn't do anything, why he didn't help that boy. Callum, confused, replied that he was just waiting for his turn. The father explained if he was older, he should help others. He said that evil only triumphs when good people do nothing. These words stayed in Callum's memory. Now he was again in a situation where a choice had to be made. If the Fae were really hunting humans, he had a duty to intervene. But he realized that any action he took could attract the attention of the Magical Regulation Guild, which was already suspicious of him after the incident with the vampires. The guy decided it was better to just leave, open a portal, and disappear. However, a sharp, familiar sound stopped him. It was the Fae and other monsters. They felt that there was enough time before sunrise to finish their hunt. Callum, sensing their movement, began to worry. He realized that he couldn't just leave, knowing that the men would be killed. Equal sign, his upbringing demanded that he intervene. He activated his spatial perception, extending his radius to 600 meters to keep an eye on the Fae. Staying undetected was difficult, but he kept them under control by observing their numbers. If anyone disappeared from sight, he would have to teleport and change his plan. He had 24 rounds of ammo now, but he wasn't going to kill the Fae. His goal is to rescue people and get them to safety. He decided that he would shelter them in caves near the mountains. It is a temporary shelter, but there they can wait out the hunt. Meanwhile, Hannah fell down, exhausted. The boy picked her up, even though he realized they had less and less time. Suddenly, he noticed a dark silhouette in the bushes approaching them. The stranger commanded the silhouette not to come any closer. But realizing their consternation, the guy calmed them down by saying that he had come to help them. He explained that there was no time for details and they should follow his instructions. Callum said there was a pine tree 180 meters away, on the plain, and they should get there as quickly as possible. He promised that he would watch them from afar, but he could not accompany them. Using magic in his presence might give him away to the Fae. The men, though hesitant, went to the pine tree. Reaching their destination, they stopped to wait for him. At this moment, however, a portal suddenly opened beneath them, and in a moment, they found themselves teleported away. Landing on the ground, they shrieked in surprise. Callum appeared beside them and apologized for being abrupt and for not warning them to group up when they fell. They were now a kilometer away from where they were being chased. Guy questioned them about how they had gotten into this situation and why the Fae were hunting them. The humans told him that it was like a wild hunt. The monsters were playing with them, enjoying the pursuit, and if they lived to see the sunrise, they would stay alive. Callum erupted with anger, recognizing that it was all just entertainment for the Fae. Wasting no time, he opened the portal and left them, deciding that the only way to deal with the monsters was to destroy them once and for all. Meanwhile, the Fae began to notice that something had gone wrong. The sun was still far away, but their numbers began to dwindle. They were discussing what had happened when a portal opened under several dryads, and they fell through it. The others were confused, not realizing what was happening, and decided to report it to their monarchs. Suddenly, a huge stone was lifted into the air by magic, until the magic abruptly disappeared and the stone came crashing down with a rumble, crushing several of them. One of the Fae managed to spot Callum taking cover on a mountain ridge and ordered the dryad to shoot him, a magic-enhanced arrow. It flew with incredible speed, but Callum managed to open a portal and escape. He managed to get rid of a few pixies by teleporting them through small portals, but it wasn't enough. These creatures were too fast. The guy felt that he had less and less time left. Suddenly, he heard a rustling behind him. A large branch was flying straight towards him at an incredible speed. There was a violent blow, and Callum fell to the ground. He instantly drew his pistol, and, seized with fear, began firing towards the tree. He did not see the monster, but suddenly the dryad was at his back. The blow on his back threw him several meters forward, and he hit a rock with force. He couldn't understand how the monster had been able to approach so silently. Obviously, it was magic. Callum activated his search ability to find the target. Upon discovering that the dryad was hiding inside the tree, he attacked it with his sword, forcing the creature to come out. It was now clear. The dryad was moving from tree to tree. Callum tried to fire a shot, but it had time to run to another tree. The only way to overpower her was to strike from an unexpected angle, where the creature's speed wouldn't matter. Concentrating, he watched the dryad's movements and, choosing the perfect moment, he opened a portal right next to her hiding place. A second later, a shot flew out of the portal, hitting the target in the head. Callum took no pleasure in killing, but these creatures were hunting humans. This was unforgivable. Finished with Dryad, he teleported her body to an unknown location. The elf found himself in a dark cave. He couldn't breathe and tried to figure out where he was. Taking a step forward, the creature saw the bodies of his crew brutally murdered. Frightened, elf screamed. Meanwhile, Callum had successfully rescued the lost men. They offered him thanks, but he refused, asking only to forget everything that had happened, especially his involvement. He understood how traumatic their experience had been, but felt it would be better for them to recover from what had happened on their own. Callum later contacted Chester for advice. He recounted the encounter with the Fae and asked how much of an impact it might have. Chester, having heard of the pixies, dryads, and elves, warned that they were noble Fae. Their monarchs, upon hearing what had happened, would definitely want revenge. Chester offered to work for him, promising protection, but Callum refused. After his recent conflicts with the Magic Regulation Guild, he valued his freedom. He agreed to perform tasks from time to time, but he had no intention of remaining under anyone's control. Finished talking, Chester asked Lucy her opinion of Callum. She suggested that he had become braver since his escape from the guild. However, now he has attracted too much attention. Chester instructed her to find out all about his past. A few months ago, Callum was just an ordinary man. But magicians don't just become magicians. He may have powerful relatives behind him. Callum got to the airport and began to doubt the validity of his plan. He realized that Chester was right. He needed to find a place to rest and be safe from supernatural threats. Even in a small town like Vinnet, they'd already found him. However, he was left with one option, the portal world. Callum learned about it the day he gained his magical powers, thanks to Agent Sen. This world was difficult to access because of the heavily guarded entrances, which could only be accessed with the escort of powerful mages. But Callum hoped to bypass the defenses. The problem was the location of the right portal, across the ocean. There was too much security at the airport, and the ticket could easily be traced. Walking through the crowd, he considered his options. Suddenly, he bumped into a girl who felt a jolt, but when he looked around, he saw no one. Callum was testing a new invisibility spell. he had been working on with Gale and was pleased with the result. However, he was aware of the need for caution so as not to attract attention. At that moment, he noticed the thief fleeing with the lady's purse and the guards pursuing him. Callum decided not to intervene, but seeing that the purse belonged to an elderly woman, he could not stay away. Without the use of magic, he placed an invisible footstool, which caused the thief to fall. The guards quickly apprehended the criminal, and Callum noticed that the guard had an access card. He used it to break into the office. Meanwhile, King Gisserel surveyed the site of the recent battle where the Fae died. The mussed grass, scattered rocks, and broken branches clearly indicated the presence of a mage with no respect for nature. Gisserel used earth magic to discover the truth. The earth showed him Callum's image and everything that had happened in the battle. The king admitted that he did not know the man, but he was interested in the identity of the magician. Despite his hatred of the Fae, he decided to do his duty to the fallen and avenge them. Gisserel began to move equal sign along the magical trail of the wind, which led them straight to the airport. The forest creatures stopped in front of the building. The airport guards demanded they leave, but King Gisserel was furious. He grabbed one of the guards with hands formed from branches and squeezed his head with force. The man cried out in pain and fell dead. Gisserel realized that it was dangerous to stay here and ordered his companions to leave the place. They left, leaving the chaos behind, and branches began to grow from the body of the dead guard. Callum found himself inside the airplane. There weren't many people, and he took the moment to hide in the bathroom. There he examined his body, covered in wounds. The fight with the Dryad had taken its toll. He could use Gale's abilities now. Who could heal such injuries? He remembered her with guilt, realizing that he had encouraged her to learn forbidden spells. Her only mistake was crossing paths with him. Maybe one day he would find a way to redeem himself. A few hours later, the girl Callum accidentally bumped into at the airport met King Gisserel. She was affiliated with the Magic Regulation Guild and received his signal. Gisserel explained that he was pursuing a criminal, but a storm prevented him. One of the human mages interfered, so the king demanded that the guild intervene and bring the culprit to justice. Gisserel was later joined by Ray Danforth, a mage investigator. The king told him what he had seen at the scene. Magic capable of tearing space. Ray immediately realized who he was talking about. It was Callum, a particularly dangerous mage involved in the vampire massacre. Ray asked for the exact coordinates of Callum's last appearance so that he could begin searching for him. Meanwhile, Callum had reached the town of Matterhorn in Switzerland. A portal to the Dragon World, one of the most dangerous places, opened before him. There was only one observer mage on duty at the portal, which surprised Callum. He assumed that the system of protection here was based on minimizing the risks to the human world, not on complete security. Callum decided to use minimal magic to pass undetected. He threw a rock under the guard's feet, diverting his attention, and, while he tried to find a walkie-talkie to report the strange stone, the protagonist slipped through to the portal. Taking a step, he found himself in the Dragon World. He was struck by the beauty of his surroundings. The air was saturated with mana, which literally flowed around him. The portal was much more complex in structure than any he had seen or created. Callum wanted to sketch, but suddenly heard a rustling behind him. Fire magic surrounded his body, causing intense pain. It was a dragon that appeared to a mortal who had broken the laws of his world. The dragon declared that Callum must pay for his invasion, but then his anger changed to surprise. The dragon recognized Callum and even called out his last name. It turned out that this dragon was Shahui, whom Callum already knew. An urgent message arrived on the agent's phone. They started forming a team to catch Callum Wells. No one could believe that one fugitive was causing so much trouble. He turned the whole guild upside down, disappearing as quickly as if he were a ghost. Agent Sen, having been put in an uncomfortable situation by his escape, was now determined to settle the score. Callum, meanwhile, was socializing with Shahe. The dragon, distrustful of the guild, wondered what could have brought the boy here. Callum assured him he wasn't stalking him, just looking for a secluded place to hide. He assumed that even if the guild and the Fae started looking for him in the Dragon World, it would be impossible. No one would dare to challenge the inhabitants of this dimension. Shehai explained that dragons can destroy and create matter, equal sign, and in their true form they are so large that they exceed the size of continents. Callum decided to ask about the recent attack in the gym, but Shahai replied that it was a personal conflict that did not concern him. Mentioning avatars, the dragon demonstrated this ability by turning into a cook. These were puppets, as his true form could not pass through the portal, much less walk around in the human world. Callum marveled that he could see Shahai in his true form all this time. The dragon assumed it was a rare ability, perhaps inherited from his father. When it came to Callum's parents, he was told that his grandparents raised him as their own son. The boy's mother ran away from home as a young girl, returned pregnant but soon left again. Callum realized why the subject was never brought up. To them, it was too hard. Shahai advised against staying here, since dragons avoid interfering in the affairs of humans, but he still had to warn him of the consequences. When asked where else to take refuge, the dragon offered several options. The safest is the Land of Fairy, though it is unpredictable. The Nightlands would be suitable if Callum is preparing for a guild war. The necessary magical materials can be obtained there. Shahe reminded that the supernatural world is divided into the strong and the weak. Turning into a large dragon, he advised him to choose the path of the strong. Meanwhile, Ray Danforth received a request from the Department of Secret Investigations and went to see Agent Arthur. However, the latter was unable to provide new information. Arthur remembered that Callum used to live under a different name and was very withdrawn. When asked about possible connections in Europe, the sheriff only waved his hands. Their provincial town was far from international intrigue. While Ray tried to move the investigation forward, his colleague, Felicia Black, managed to get something from the werewolf girl, Clara. She used suggestion the child told of the vampires who kidnapped her and the unknown person who rescued her. This confirmed the theory about the personal background of the first massacre, but it gave no new information. The investigation urgently needed a fresh impetus, or they risked a dead end. Callum was near the portal to the Nightlands. There were considerably more guards here than at the other passageways, but he noticed that the defense spells left much to be desired. If the Dragon World resembled a high-tech vault, this portal was like a school locker. It seemed too simple to be true, but there was only one way to check. Opening his own portal, Callum stealthily passed through the defenses. Neither guards nor spells stopped him. As he entered, he felt a stark contrast. Whereas on the other side it was day, here it was deep night. Perhaps it is always dark in the Nightlands. Looking around, he noticed a small settlement. To his surprise, he found not only vampires, but ordinary mages as well. According to Shahe, mages are forbidden to enter the Dragon World, but it was different in the Nightlands. This area turned out to be a haven for those who wanted to hide. Mages who despise humans and vampires coexisted here, which explained the weak security of the portal. Spells would only interfere with the free movement of the inhabitants. However, Callum quickly realized that hiding here was the worst idea. The Nightlands were swarming with creatures that would either imprison or kill him. In the distance, a group of vampires were dealing with the wolves that had attacked them. One of them suddenly smelled a strange odor. The vampiress asked her comrade if he sensed a presence, but he only smelled blood. It was strange. Mages rarely ventured into this place. The vampiress contacted the operator to report her find. The operator ordered her and her partner to return to base. The vampires glanced around. Perhaps they had stumbled upon something really important. At the base, they were met by the Supreme Mage Tyson, representative of the Bureau of Magical Security. Surprised to find a mage in front of them instead of a warlord, the scouts reported their observations. Tyson clarified whether they were sure it was a mage they were talking about. The vampire noted that the odor was human, but could not determine the type of magic. Tyson explained the reason for his presence. One of the escaped mages could be hiding in the portal worlds, and this person is a serious threat. It remains to be seen how dangerous this mage is, but the Bureau considers him a top-level threat. He gave a name, Callum Wells. All scouts should be on alert. Callum finds himself in the Nightlands. The most dangerous thing here isn't the vampires. It's the pulsating moon. With each stroke, the ground beneath his feet shifted as if the world itself were alive. He knew he had to find the sea notes to get the magic materials. But he quickly realized that this path was not so easy. At night, while searching for a cenote, Callum heard a strange noise and climbed out of his tent. He saw a giant beetle fighting a woodchuck. The beetle turned out to be a bloodsucker that uses sea notes for nesting. Callum decided to follow it, hoping it would lead him to the right place. The woodpecker had the advantage in the fight, and the beetle could die. He must not be allowed to leave evidence of his presence. So he decided to use magic. He opened a portal right next to the wooden man's arm, and when he swung, the monster punched through his body. After the bloodsucker flew away, Callum followed him, and found his lair filled with bloodsuckers, and a strange liquid at the bottom of the cave. He realized it was magical material, and decided to use magic to get it out. However, when he started using powers and got the stone, the monster started to rise up, and tentacles were spilling out of the water. Callum realized that things were bad, but he didn't get confused. He teleported the dead wood over the lake, and when it fell, the monster devoured it. This gave Callum a chance. He took what he could with the portal, before disappearing without leaving a trace. A few hours later, agents arrived on the scene, immediately realizing it was Callum Wells. They reported the matter to High Magician Tyson, realizing that if they acted quickly, he could be caught. Mage Tyson moved toward the portal, believing that their first step to apprehending the culprit was to deny him an escape route. The criminal was already close, and as they entered the room, he was just stepping into the portal. They immediately rushed after him. His trail was fixed in the Nightlands, and all radar stations began tracking his location. However, the use of lethal weapons was only authorized in emergencies, and the target had to be taken alive. The protagonist, sensing pursuit, teleported 1 kilometer to the west, which the agents noticed. One of them pointed a gun at him and was authorized to fire. The bullet was fired, but the guy had already managed to enter the portal. The guild was faster than expected, but for some reason the home bond stopped working. But the hero didn't think about the difficulty, ignoring the fatigue and pain. He continued to teleport, creating hundreds of portals and moving further and further away. He was completely exhausted when he noticed that he found himself in Paris. Local passersby approached and asked if he was okay, but he didn't understand anything. They didn't speak English. Agent Sen wasted no time. He continued his pursuit, now from the air unit. He knew the hero was somewhere in the city, and despite the guy's teleportation ability, he was sure that his speed in the air was quite capable of catching up with him. Sen used the wind to track his footprints and moved around all corners of the city. When he finally spotted the hero, he launched a fireball in his direction, resulting in a massive explosion. 5 minutes earlier, the protagonist was in a panic, not realizing how he had ended up in France, and more importantly, how he had made such a mistake. He now realized that if the Magic Regulation Guild struck first, he would be in trouble. The hero decided that he needed to find a new base for his operation. But first of all, he needed to leave the country. Seeing Agent Sen, he felt disappointed. He had been discovered. Now he had to act quickly. The hero decided to open 2 portals, one in front of him to minimize the explosion, and the second behind him to fly out to safety. Everything went according to plan. The explosion happened, and he was saved by a spell. Agent Sen headed toward the site of the explosion, but only a bearing was left in its place, and the hero escaped again. Sen was furious and hit the floor with force. Meanwhile, the protagonist found himself in the forest, exhausted and badly wounded. He felt as if a truck had just crashed into him. Even though he was in pain, he realized that he had underestimated Sen, and he shouldn't have made that mistake. He wouldn't make it again, assuring himself that it would be impossible to find him now. Agent Sen used a deadly spell without authorization, which resulted in the deaths of 18 ordinary people. This became a serious problem for the Magic Regulation Guild. Since they were working in secret and couldn't afford to attract the attention of ordinary people, Mage Tyson, who was monitoring the situation, told Sen that because of his reckless actions, they might be exposed. At the same time, Tyson noted that the culprit was an unusual mage. He displayed abilities that shouldn't have been possible for a spatial aspect mage. His abilities were on par with Mage Tyson, which was ridiculous for a mage who had only recently become a mage. Tyson was sure that a mage couldn't be that strong without help. He had someone helping him by supplying him with materials and knowledge. Tyson warned that if he had to take matters into his own hands, their units would be reviewed and reformed. Agent Sen was alarmed and ready to act. The protagonist found himself on fire, not realizing what was happening. Engulfed in flames, he screamed, asking if there was anyone alive. At that moment, he heard a faint voice pleading for help. He rushed to the injured man and saw the girl huddled under a fragment of rock. Lifting it up, he helped her to get out. The girl, pointing with her hand to the man controlling the fire. Suddenly, she lunged at Callum, shouting accusations hysterically, demanding answers as to why he had let them die. Her face began to change rapidly, turning into a haggard corpse. At this point, Callum woke up abruptly. Another nightmare. He was on an airplane and tried to regain consciousness quickly so as not to attract attention. The news reported 18 deaths in a sudden kitchen fire. People burned because of his spell. He felt guilty, and these deaths would remain on his conscience forever. An announcement was heard. An airplane had just landed in Texas. At that moment, Callum felt a sharp pain in his head. The spell on the home bond began to weaken. Considering what he had done, it was surprising that it had lasted this long. Cheap materials lose strength quickly. Fortunately, he had a plan. If he wanted to get stronger, he needed to improve the home bond. He headed to the store and asked the saleswoman if she worked with metal. He needed something special made, and luckily, she specialized in such orders. Callum showed the blueprints. The foreman was surprised at the complexity of the work. The girl said they could fulfill the order if he had the right materials. He opened his bag, showing off his supplies. The master began to look at them curiously, amazed at the rarity of the alloy. A few tests were needed to determine the melting point, but it should be ready in a few days. It had been quite some time since he had last created something useful. A couple tricks aren't enough to fool the Magical Regulation Guild. He has to keep learning. He thought about it. If he had enough resources, he could create a small teleportation network similar to the guild system. In theory, he could use it to move around the world in seconds. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was Lucy. She immediately realized that he had been attacked by the guild mages again. Moreover, there were rumors that he was moving between worlds like a ghost. It was easier for the guild to make him a villain than to admit that he had managed to bypass their guards. Lucy suggested 2 versions. Either the guild is just a bunch of incompetent knuckleheads unable to protect their worlds, or he really is so powerful that he can destroy them with a single spell. She hasn't decided which version she likes better yet. Callum has begun to create a thread of this. At first glance, it seemed insignificant. But once he imbued it with spatial energy, the magic gathered into a sphere. As the thread expanded to form a huge orb, he took a paper clip and pierced it. At the same instant, the magical energy burst out and the paper clip dissolved into thin air. Finally, he succeeded in creating a space that was bigger on the inside than the outside. It didn't allow traveling through time and dimensions, but it opened up tremendous possibilities. Now, if he learned to simplify the process, he wouldn't have to rent lockers all over the states. He could carry his own magical vault. Sunlight came into the room. It was already noon. Callum realized that if it was Friday, he should look in the workshop. When he went into the store, he saw a tired-looking craftswoman. The alloy was unusual. At first it looked like lead, but its melting point was different, so some experiments had to be made. In the end, the material was able to be brought into working condition, and she created 3 kilograms of thin wire, even more than Callum expected. Plus, she had enough material left over to make additional copies. As a result, he now had not just an improved device, but as many as 5 home bonds. This was unexpected, and he thanked the craftswoman admiringly, but she asked for a hefty fee, leaving him with almost no money. This expenditure reminded him to call Lucy. They hadn't spoken since their last awkward conversation, and Callum feared he would embarrass himself again. However, when he called, she immediately answered, casually calling him a tough guy and then being embarrassed. He said hello, and Lucy assumed he wanted to fire her. But it was the opposite. Callum offered her a job. He needed help selling his new invention, an advanced and fully autonomous home bond, unconnected to the guild network. Lucy immediately realized how serious this was. Unregistered magical devices were worth a fortune on the black market, but their owners risked jail time or even execution. Apparently, the price could run into the millions, but the main problem was, who would risk buying one? Lucy warned that such deals were too dangerous, but if a buyer was found, she would take a percentage. Meanwhile, Archmage Hargrave was furious. He could not understand how Callum had managed to escape again. Agent Jean reported that he had left no trace, his magic signature was too low, and Viss's hiding methods were impeccable. They had 2 attempts to catch the fugitive, and both failed. After all, this man had defiled his precious granddaughter, and he wasn't about to let it go unpunished. He ordered Jean to take on an important mission. In his opinion, Callum had an accomplice within the guild. Archimagus Duval was also interested in the case, and Hargrave instructed an agent to lead an internal investigation. He suspected there was a mole in their midst. The next day, Callum called Lucy and asked if there was any news about the home bond purchase. She admitted that it was complicated for now. She had few criminal connections. Suddenly, however, the best buyer was Chester, the same alpha he already knew. Callum was wary, too convenient. Was Chester just trying to do him a favor? But Lucy explained that only Duval usually created such devices. If an alternative manufacturer came along, there would be questions. Chester, with his influence, could keep the matter quiet. Callum didn't want to get involved in the werewolf-vampire squabble, but he was almost out of money. If he really wants to build a bunker to protect himself from the guild, he needs funds. He finally agreed to meet with Chester, but he needed to finish the enchantment first. Lucy set the meeting for tomorrow. Callum realized that the quality had to be perfect. Every time he used Homebond, he felt slightly nauseous, and he didn't want to imagine Chester constantly taking medication after teleporting. Plus, werewolves couldn't control magic like mages do, so a standard magic ring for activation wasn't enough. He decided to make 2 connected plates. It would be easier to use the device that way. The work took all night, but he finally created a pair of home bonds, perfect for Chester. The next day, he contacted Alpha, who immediately guessed that the magician had something interesting. Callum offered him a teleportation network not tied to the guild. Chester was clearly interested, but Callum immediately warned it would be expensive. Chester was willing to pay good money. Callum explained that he had adapted the device specifically for him, without unnecessary elements of the guild. The simpler, the more inconspicuous. Safety, too, he removed, having tested everything on himself. He also asked Chester to wire 20% of Lucy's value, as a commission for finding a buyer. Alpha agreed and asked her to send details of the location of the stash. The transaction went well, and Callum was pleased with the cooperation. Meanwhile, the agents were suddenly summoned to headquarters, and it was clearly not good news. Ray Danforth offered to bet Felicia Black which one of them would be fired first. When they entered the office, Agent Jean thanked them for their promptness. The conversation immediately began to be recorded. Ray was the first to give his name. Then Jean turned to Felicia, noticing her concern. He assured her that he was protected from her abilities, so she had nothing to worry about. The first question was how many years they'd been working together. Ray replied that it had been quite a while. Jean then asked if they had any ties to organizations outside of the guild. Felicia denied everything. But further questions became more serious. Had they divulged secret information to outsiders? The agents were surprised by the accusations. Ray assured them that they were not stupid enough to make an enemy of the guild. Jean brought up the Callum Wells case. Both agents were in the room when he escaped, which looked suspicious. But they had acted according to protocol. No one could have guessed that he would be able to teleport away. Then Jean asked the ultimate question. Did they consider themselves competent? After all, criminal mages don't often manage to escape right from under the noses of agents. Ray admitted that they had failed, but that only adds to their motivation to catch him. Jean, after listening to them, informs them that he is relieving them of their current duties by order of Archmage Hargrave. The agents are alarmed and angry. No one but them will do a better job. But Jean clarified that he was not dismissing them, but transferring them to another assignment. There is reason to believe that Callum has an informant in the guild. He invited them to join the investigation. In the morning, Lucy is awakened by the ringing of her alarm clock and looked at her watch and was horrified. She was late. Running to the elevator, she saw the doors close right in front of her nose. No one even tried to hold them open. She was angry at the mages again. They were treating her like trash, even though she was also from a magical family. Upon reaching work, she received a notice. All employees to report to the first floor immediately. Agent Jean announced that there was a problem at the guild, and they would now interview the employees. Those who have nothing to hide have nothing to worry about. Everything will be strictly confidential. At that moment, Felicia Black used her magic, silencing everyone. Jean read out the ID numbers, and when Lucy's name was called, she entered the interrogation room. She couldn't be resisted. The agent was forcing her to tell the truth. Felicia asked if Lucy had ever passed on information to which the guild restricted access. Lucy fearfully replied that she had not. This was not a lie. She was not handing over, but selling data. The agent further clarified whether she knew anyone who had distributed prohibited information to outsiders. Lucy told a boring story from 5 years ago. She was then asked about her cooperation with Alpha Chester. She explained that she provided technical support and troubleshooting. That was what she was hired to do. Felicia asked if she had any serious connections beyond the guild and Chester's pack. Lucy tensed, trying not to say too much. The agent got angry and ordered her to answer. Excitedly, almost stammering, Lucy admitted that she sometimes chatted with her boyfriend while working. Felicia snorted disappointedly. She didn't care about other people's personal lives. The interrogation ended, and Lucy was released. Jean analyzed all the answers, but no one confessed anything. It seemed to them that the investigation would go faster if the officers knew why they were being questioned. But this was against agency policy, especially internal affairs. Meanwhile, the Fae were already starting to spread rumors, and if the others found out about the guild's internal problems, the balance between magical beings may collapse. War will become inevitable. While the staff was distracted, Danforth searched them for signs of magic. Some turned out to have personal watchers, but nothing suspicious. Jean was annoyed. Sometimes the leads just aren't there. But he didn't believe Lucy was as clean as she seemed. His intuition told him she was worth watching. Meanwhile, the protagonist was using Homebond, which worked even better than he expected. He got rid of the side effects of nausea and stomach pain. Now all that was left to do was to deliver the Homebond to the specified location and get the money. But before doing so, he tried to call Lucy but could not reach her. He knew at once that something was wrong. Perhaps she had been caught. He decided to drown his phone so the guild couldn't track his location, and used disposable phones to contact Chester. He was in a hurry to get to the place where Chester had left the money, but remained alert, ready to escape. Time passed, but Lucy did not make contact. He began to worry and decided that maybe he should call Chester. But he realized that Lucy might have changed her number for security reasons. So he headed for the self-storage facility. He opened the locker, revealing a bag of gold bars. There was so much gold that one might as well not work all his life. But the thought of Lucy kept him busy. Suddenly, Lucy called him. She apologized for the missed call and explained that she was checking her devices to make sure she wasn't being tracked. The guild could have planted a listening device on her. She said they were questioned and tried to get information about it. Lucy was able to convince them that she had no useful information and they let her go. But the interrogation changed her view of the guild. Callum was comforted by the thought that she was not inactive, but helping him. She offered to help, but she had bad news. The guild had caught those he had saved in the Forest of Fairy. The letter had been intercepted, and now they were being taken to one of the guild's offices in Miami. Callum immediately decided to go there to rescue them. Lucy warned him that this operation could be a trap, and he should be careful. But he was determined. He would not stop until he had saved them. Fae, werewolves, mages. Miami is packed with a variety of supernatural creatures, and the protagonist senses the V's and mana flowing everywhere. It is because of this that he can easily blend into the crowd, being one mage among many. He finally finds the office of the Magic Regulation Guild in Miami, where the two people he rescued earlier are being held. There were many observers and guild agents around. Had to find a safe place to work. Callum concentrated, and despite the many supernatural beings, noticed that there were ordinary people working in the office, secretaries, cleaners, and office staff. Tearing down the building with a termite would be pointless because the guild would be held accountable for their actions, but Callum wasn't about to kill the innocent. He had to be better than his enemies. He realized he couldn't do it alone. A way must be found to keep these people safe, and for that, he would need to enlist Lucy's help. She inquired about the progress of the rescue, but Callum said it had not yet begun. He realized that he couldn't just get them out, as the guild would start a hunt, and someone would have to take responsibility for their safety. It would have to be someone super strong who could stand up to the guild, such as an Archmage. An option was one of the Fae Kings, because they like to fight each other, and it could be beneficial. Callum was interested in the idea of convincing one of the Fae Kings to take these men under his protection, thus messing with the other king. He had already earned some reputation, and rumor has it that King Gisserel had searched all over the world for him, but to no avail. Lucy agrees to arrange a meeting with the king. King Farachar was surprised that someone dared to demand a meeting with him and even hide his face. But he was interested when he learned that Callum wanted to make the guild nervous and mess with Gisserel. Callum explained that he had no political interest, but that his actions might have consequences that the king would like. Farachar agreed to help, though he expected more from the meeting. He promised that if the guild did not hold back and these men were on his doorstep, he would feign ignorance and shelter them. Callum was satisfied that he had made a deal with him, and now his reputation continued to grow, though it might play a cruel joke on him in the future. But now he needed to act. The escape plan was ready, but it all depended on whether he could keep his end of the bargain. To save these two, he needed to sneak into the office of the Magic Regulation Guild. Callum had long wondered how the guild maintained its surveillance system. Such a complex structure must consume an enormous amount of mana. At first he thought it was some technique he hadn't mastered yet, but now he realized what the secret was. At the back of the building was a small portal connected to some portal world. It was too small to pass through, but large enough to pump out unlimited mana, powering the entire guild network. If he wants to go undetected and rescue the captives, he needs to destroy this portal. But transportation was required first. Getting two people across town on a motorcycle was impossible, but a small truck would be a lot less conspicuous. He loaded the trunk with everything he needed and prepared for the next step. He'd wanted to stay out of sight for a long time after his encounter with Agent Sen, but he couldn't just sit back and watch the guild destroy other people's lives. It was time to take action. Step 1 is to prepare the water jar. Step 2, create a small string from Vis and make a spatial vault with more space inside than it appears. Step 3, dip the string into the water and use it to store all the liquid. Step 4 is to fill the jar with metal scraps. Once the storage collapses, the water will rush outward, causing an explosion. A simple but effective homemade nail bomb. Now all that was left was to place it near the portal. When the bomb went off, the structure supporting the portal would collapse, and with it the entire surveillance system would be disabled. He took a deep breath and made up his mind. A tremor was felt inside the building, and nail bombs began to fly through the portal. The explosions were not too powerful. Their purpose was not to destroy, but to distract and create panic. As the people in the office began to bustle about, a portal opened beneath the prisoners, and they fell into the van. They immediately recognized their savior. Callum explained that he was taking them to safety and they should just sit tight. The victims wondered why someone was always following them. Callum apologized. He was the one who got them into his trouble. They inquired who he was and what was going on. 1626, but he just said it wasn't important. After today, they would never see him again. One of the rescued men got angry and started to resent him, but the girl stopped him, explaining that Callum was only trying to help. He replied that he understood them. He had once been in their situation himself. This otherworldly world bursts in suddenly and ruins everything that seemed to be unchangeable. He has made arrangements with people who will be able to protect them. They will be safe, and then they can decide for themselves what to do from there. There was only a little more to go by, and in the rearview mirror, he noticed police cars. They were pulling over. Callum was so focused on the guild that he completely forgot about the common people. Now the police were involved, which meant there could be agents somewhere nearby. If he didn't get rid of the tail right now, they would be caught. The victims asked why he didn't just teleport them out of here. Callum replied that it would attract too much attention and the police had been chasing them for too long already. The longer this goes on, the greater the chance that the guild agents will suspect something. The car stopped and the policeman asked to open the window. Callum said hello, but the officer said he smelled a strange odor coming from the cabin and decided to check it out. The protagonist realized that it was because of the substance he had sprayed the car with to deter werewolves. The captives began to act as if they were not quite sober. The policeman decided not to waste time and just told Callum to take them home. But suddenly the protagonist noticed the guild agent and realized he had to get out. He stepped on the gas sharply and the car took off. Suddenly several agents whizzed over them at an incredible speed. Callum realized it was reinforcements. After the attack on the office building, the guild wouldn't leave him alone. But they had almost made it to the safe zone. They are now in Fey territory, and this is where he will be able to open the portal. He asked the captives to go through there and tell them that the Phantom had sent them. The deal is done, he has delivered them, and now they must leave on their own. He promised that his friend would contact them when things were settled. The victims went into the portal and thanked him. Meanwhile, Ray Danforth surveyed the scene of the break-in and didn't understand why the security was so lax. He had warned everyone that Callum might come, so why weren't they ready? The guards explained that patrols had been stepped up, werewolf and vampire teams had been deployed, and the surveillance network was working without interruption. Felicia noticed that her partner was angrier than usual. He tried to keep her away from the local Fae, knowing she had a problem with them. The agent looked for clues, but found only puddles of water and metal debris. Suddenly the Archmage showed up. He said it was only the blood of the sea, and said that one of their suspects was much stronger than they thought. This cycle moves on its own and sweeps away everything in its path. The Archmage said to call Duvala. She is the only one who can make sense of what has happened. Duvalet was trying to meditate when her phone suddenly rang. Agent Ray reported that they ran into Callum Wells again. Although no one had seen him, he had taken 2 people out of custody, and the crime technique matched his style. Traces of spatial magic were found at the scene, and Ray hoped that Duval would be able to do an expert analysis. Duval irritatedly called them useless and wondered when it happened. She quickly packed up and went to the headquarters of the Magic Regulation Guild in Miami. Ray explained that there was damage to the teleportation structure in the area of the incident, and they believe Wells used his magic to move something important. Upon arriving at the scene, Duval immediately began her analysis. Her mind remained focused on the spatial magic Wells had left behind. She felt that the magic was crude, yet precise and accurate. The magical traces left behind were absorbed by a metal debris that resembled the magic used earlier. This criminal was dangerous and strange, and his methods continued to baffle. At this moment, Archmage Wheezy appeared in the room. He was not invited, but stated that he had come on his own business. Duvalet, annoyed, demanded that he explain his intentions at once. Wheezy stated that he was curious to know about Callum Wells and his connection with the events going on around him. He claimed that he had long ago promised to destroy every criminal and those who collaborated with them, even if it involved fellow magicians. Wheezy was one of the oldest mages, and his oddities were of little surprise to Duval. However, she kept her guard up, for she knew how to deal with such personalities. A black magic ball appeared in her hands, but Wheezy only grinned, declaring that someday he too would encounter this magic art. Jean's analysis showed that Wells had used a subtle technique to pass unnoticed. But the question remained as to how he managed to bypass the defenses from such a distance. Realizing that more surveillance was needed, Jean suggested increased security at headquarters, although he said it was impossible to protect all facilities. Expectations were high that if they could predict Wells' next move, they could prepare for an attack. Meanwhile, Cullum was on his way to Mexico. He decided to wait before calling Lucina. He knew that calling in the middle of an investigation could draw unnecessary attention and put her in danger. He hoped the situation would calm down, and he would dial her in a few days when things had subsided. For now, he concentrated on finding a new base. At this time, Jean learned that the Fae had harbored two people whose names had been wiped from their memories through magic. Although they remembered their existence, no one in the guild knew who they were. Hargrave realized that these men were working with the Fae and asked what the King of Miami thought about it. He tried to conceal his intentions, but it was obvious that he was up to something. Hargrave believed that if they could get these men out of hiding, they could get to those associated with Wells as well. Most of those in his network are protected by werewolves, or by the magic of the Skelthoof Guardians, and only a few remain unprotected. However, it was clear that someone was passing information to Wells, and it had to be stopped. The agent agreed with the plan and suggested finding an informant who could lead to Wells. Once they caught this traitor, Wells himself would come running to them, and they could catch him. Lucy sat at the bar, deciding that getting drunk wasn't the worst way out of the situation. She hadn't been happy with her life lately, and this evening alone seemed like a good option. The barista asked who she worked for, and Lucy replied that she was an IT specialist for a security company. There was a big data leak recently, and now investigators are literally following her every move. But the worst part was that she hadn't heard from her friend in a week, and was worried that he was mad at her. Lucy admitted that perhaps her actions were not quite right, for she had led him into danger for her own gain. The barmaid was pouring a drink and said that in her opinion it was okay to drink to such worries. Suddenly the bell rang. Lucy recognized the number and happily picked up the phone. It was Callum. He apologized, explaining that after saving the two in Miami, he disappeared because he was worried about her. The guild, he said, was in dire straits and he didn't want to jeopardize it. He was in Mexico and asked for a map of the area showing all the supernatural sites. Lucy found the map and promised to send it to him. She felt depressed, thinking he was only calling for business. But Callum explained that he appreciated her help and was grateful for the information about the two men. He promised that if she was in trouble, he would always be there to help. After talking to him, Lucy went back to the barmaid. She asked if there were any drinks that might help calm the storm in her heart, for she seemed to be in love. The next day, Callum was at a business meeting. He was going to buy land to build a house, and hoped the seller could help him with local building companies. The salesman asked why he had chosen this location, and Callum explained that his friends had recommended the area, but what he was really interested in was the land near the portal world, where the remnants of magic could help him set up a base. The price of the land was high, but Callum was not deterred and offered to pay it in gold bullion, which was enough to get the seller to agree to the deal. Meanwhile, the vampire Antoine was furious. His people hadn't recruited new vampires in nearly 60 years, all because the guild hadn't caught a criminal mage. Jean-Marie tried to calm the vampire by explaining that everything that could be done had already been done, and if he wanted, he could go to the Nightlands himself to look for more vampires. Antoine wasn't going to stop there and called everyone in the guild useless. He turned around and left, but Jean-Marie suggested a good idea. They should act on their own to find the killer. The vampires know an important person who can help them. It was about Clara Langley. The vampire agreed with the idea and ordered her and all the Langleys to be taken. Need to find them to deal with the criminal magician once and for all. The werewolves learned that the vampires were headed for Venute. Lavin and his nest continued to pester them, and Alpha Chester believed that the coming of the vampires to Vinut was only a matter of time. He marveled that they didn't come back right away. Chester assumed it was an official mission, and decided to summon Jasper. It was a good moment to test the new home bond. The sheriff contacted Alpha and was informed that the vampires were indeed headed their way. Apparently they're in a bad mood because their mutual friend didn't show up, so they decided to get revenge. Alpha arranged for the vampires to stay with him because after all, Lavin's vampires are after the sheriff's family. Arthur asked what would happen to the town. It wouldn't do to leave it to its fate. But Chester reassured him, saying that he would deal with the vampires himself. He suspected that someone might have blabbed that the whole vampire thing had started because of Clara. If she hadn't been kidnapped, Ghost might not have gotten involved. The heroes used the home bond to teleport Arthur's family to his home. Chester warned that the sheriff shouldn't expect a long rest. The vampires would be destroyed quickly. The teleportation plate wasn't too big, so it wouldn't be possible to move everyone at the same time. But it worked, and someone should be thankful for that ingenuity. Once they were done in Venuta, Alpha Chester would send a message to Jasper, and he would teleport them back. Late at night, Alpha wonders if the vampires have shown up yet. Not yet, but one of the werewolves asked to watch every direction. If the vampires show up, they'll know right away. We need to stay in fighting shape. At this time, the vampires took up their positions preparing to attack. Their speed is their greatest advantage over the werewolves. The battle will be decided in a matter of seconds. The werewolves triggered on reflex. 10 figures were spotted nearby. All werewolves were ordered to take their positions. The vampires expected Langley to be here, not the werewolves. So they were going to use that advantage. It had been a long time since Chester had had an excuse to use his battle form. But the magic flowing through the pack was as powerful as it had been the day he came into the world. He began to turn into a werewolf, determined that he would not allow anyone to threaten his people. Vampires and werewolves clashed in a fierce battle. The vampires soon realized it wasn't Langley they were up against. Their adversary learned that an attack had been prepared. In this battle, the vampires had almost no chance of victory. But Alas was pleased that Chester had finally decided to show himself. He felt that the only thing he could do now was to bring his master Chester's head. With incredible speed, he rushed at him, attacking him from behind. Alas acted masterfully. His attack was so fast that he was able to wound Chester. The vampire recognized that the Alpha was indeed fast, but he was still faster. If Chester had hesitated for even a fraction of a second, his heart would have ended up in his opponent's hands. This moment startled him, and for a moment he froze, but immediately came to his senses. Grabbing Alas by the shoulders, he tore him in two with force. The vampire was dead. The others, seeing Chester's true strength, froze in horror. Alpha roared and ordered the werewolves to destroy all enemies. The vampires, realizing the battle was lost, turned to flee. The next morning it was clear that the werewolves had won. Chester said that if Lavin wanted to kill him, he should send someone stronger than one pathetic henchman. He then inquired how the others were doing. The werewolves only got off with a few scratches. Their ambush had worked perfectly. The teleportation device proved invaluable. The ability to sneak in unnoticed brought the werewolves victory. Alpha praised his warriors. They had fought well. From that day on, Venut became vampire-free. The next day, the protagonist began training. Lately, there had been so much work that there was no time left for exercises. Magic, of course, is good, but physical form should also be maintained. Spells do not always save. Although, considering that he was going to settle near one of the portal worlds, the lack of access to mana didn't bother him. It literally surrounded him, making him feel maximally energized. He seemed capable of creating a perpetual motion machine in a couple hours. It was worth it for him to build a bunker, and he could supply it with energy while remaining completely autonomous. Now his portals had no range limitations, and telekinesis seemed like something commonplace. Meanwhile, the guild agents were discussing the situation. Ray warned Felicia not to use her magic. She just waved it off, claiming it was convenient. Let the humans do their dirty work for them while they can sit back and watch. A coworker told Ray that he had reviewed the reports and found a curious pattern. Their suspect wasn't just causing carnage, but was acting in an increasingly calculated manner. He used to just barge in and slaughter everyone, but now his attacks were becoming more deliberate. That meant he was learning. And at an alarming rate, Wells went from amateur to seasoned killer in a matter of months. People who grow rapidly in skill often overestimate their capabilities. For ordinary people, it's like speeding up on a bicycle and not slowing down in time to break a leg. And for magicians, it's like trying to cast a spell that you can't control. This thought was very accurate, and the agent was thankful for the sound reasoning. Ray asked if there was an update on scanning the guild servers. He wanted to see all of Wells' interaction logs, calls, emails, texts, money transfers. Money has always played an important role in these matters. Meanwhile, Jasper brought Lucy her share for the sale of Homebond. She preferred to receive it in gold bullion so that she could send it to the exchanger herself. Jasper warned her to be careful. This method of settlement was easily traceable. Lucy only grinned and assured her she could handle it. She was too experienced for anyone to catch her. The protagonist counted all the mordite he had received. He knew that these stones could be useful, but their value exceeded all expectations. The mining process looked impressive, but it was worth it. At this point, he set up teleportation plates near the bunker, a couple of kilometers from Venuta and also near his hometown. The final question was, what to do with the remnants of the mordite? A few stones were worth keeping in reserve, but what to do with the rest? He called Lucy and at the same time decided to check on the guild. The girl told him that they had introduced a whole carload of new rules. The schedule had gone astray and the bosses were snapping at everyone indiscriminately. He apologized for the inconvenience. On the one hand, the situation is tense, but on the other hand, everyone has been sent home on paid vacation. Guy wondered if Chester would want to buy another teleportation plate. Lucy said that he definitely wouldn't mind. After the incident in Venuta, he hadn't stopped admiring the convenience of this device. She called Chester and they discussed the deal. Alpha wanted a larger plate than last time. The protagonist promised to give it a try, but warned that it would be the last one he would be able to do anytime soon. Meanwhile, Gale tried to escape the monster. The monster threatened her, stating that she would not be able to run away forever. He would destroy everything around her until she had no place to hide. The monster stood against her, and she is only a healer. The monster caught up to her and swung, 1846, but Gale was able to dodge it. Remembering her training, she focused all her will, as if she were going to use a healing spell. Only instead of healing, 1850, she channeled her power into destruction. The creature howled, feeling its body burn from the inside out. Gale tensed, not allowing herself to lose concentration. The monster gritted its teeth and called her petty and annoying. He was slowly dying, but he found the last of his strength and lunged at her. His paw went through her body. A second later, the simulation stopped, and Gale found herself in the hall. The professor coldly noted that she had failed the task again, and this time the monster was weakened. He suggested repeating the simulation, but Gale was too angry. She abruptly cut him short, demanding that he stop speaking to her in that tone. If he wanted to teach her something, let him do it properly. Otherwise, he had better just keep quiet. The servant found out that the training had gone horribly and expressed sympathy. It's all over when they catch Callum. She still couldn't get used to that name. They had spent so many lessons together, but she still didn't really know anything about him. Gale wondered where he was now, but there was no news. It was said that he had managed to convince the Fairy King to come to his side. She asked him to let her know at once if any information came to light. She never wanted to study destructive healing, and now he had ruined her life. She's lost her family. She wants to meet him one last time. She needs to know. Why did he do this to her? A week later, the protagonist received his reward, $1 million, after Lucy picked up her commission. He wondered what Chester was planning with the new teleportation plate. Alpha asked the crew if everything was ready. The plate had already been delivered to Lavin's penthouse. But it wasn't easy. They bribed some people to bring it inside. Jasper doubted whether it was worth the risk, but Alpha thought it was the perfect time to attack. The shapeshifters went ahead with their plan and teleported away. Without transforming into their battle forms, they had to conceal their involvement in the incident. Alpha spotted one vampire and killed him by stabbing him in the stomach. Meanwhile, Roy smothered a sleeping vampire with a pillow. The murders continued quietly and unnoticed. One of the werewolves reported that there was an armory at the end of the hallway where 3 more vampires were hiding. Alpha decided to focus on Avalanche. He entered Lavin's office by kicking the door with his foot. He said it was over. Lavin remained calm, showed his blade, and asked if he recognized it. It was a sword of pure silverite, sufficient to kill him. Lavin attacked, but Alpha caught his arm and held back the blow. Then he kicked the vampire sharply with his foot. He flew backward. Antoine ordered him to fight normally, but the werewolf replied that being a werewolf wasn't just about turning into a fighting form. Lavin didn't understand what he meant, and suddenly felt a stab in the back. The swarm came up behind him and stabbed him. The avalanche began to fall, and Alpha said it would teach him a lesson. He put himself above the vampires, for they are subordinates, not a unified pack like the werewolves. Lavin, in pain, begged him to kill him, and Alpha, with one blow, cut off his head. Finished with the vampires, they cleaned up their tracks and left the penthouse so that no one would know that werewolves had been here. A few days later, the agents found important traces, about $100,000 hidden in gold. Lucy tried to cover it up, but the mistakes were noticed. She tried to separate the transactions into different exchangers, but the transactions were localized in one area. Everything pointed to her. Lucy arrived at work and was surprised that no one was there. She remembered that there was a letter in the mail telling her to come to the office, but decided to make coffee and wait. Suddenly, she heard strange noises and realized that something was wrong. She quickly reached for the phone to call the chief. But at that moment, Felicia Black approached her and ordered her not to move. Lucy realized she was being ambushed and her whole body tensed with fear. Then Ray appeared, who informed her that she had been caught conspiring with the criminal Callum Wells. She was stripped of all rights and duties in the Guild of Magical Regulation from that moment on and was detained. Meanwhile, the protagonist pondered the major supernatural centers of the country, Las Vegas, New York, and Miami. He tried to find information on the population of these cities, but the data was classified. He decided that Lucy might know more and decided to call her. She usually answered quickly, but this time he heard someone else's voice. Ray, who informed him that Lucy was in the hands of the guild. The protagonist was so angry that he destroyed the phone with magic, ending the call. The agent asked if the location could be traced, but the connection was lost before they could get a trace. Felicia offered to call back, but Callum was too cautious and it wasn't the best way to trace him. He also knew that the trap was already set. And now his only option was to rescue Lucy. Callum was gripped by fear. He didn't understand how they had managed to track Lucy. After the first interrogation, he had thought she was in no danger, but now he realized that his whole case was in jeopardy. He decided to destroy all his devices and anything that could compromise him. After thinking about just disappearing, he realized he couldn't do it. He could not leave Lucy, whom he felt was being brutally tortured, but it was impossible for him to go it alone. He decided to appeal to Alpha and Chester, asking them to meet urgently. Meanwhile, Lucy was in the White Room being interrogated. She was asked to give her name for the record, Lucille Harper. When asked how long she had been working for the Magic Regulation Guild, she said over 10 years. The interrogation continued. She was asked questions about her association with Callum Wells and her possible collusion with him. Lucy did not answer most of the questions, but Black used magic to get her to talk. Under pressure, Lucy could barely contain herself. She almost cried. At this time, Chester was surprised to learn that the meeting with the ghost would take place today, and the ghost came for Lucy. He revealed that he had tried to contact her, but the guild had already taken her into custody. He was concerned that they might have found out about the teleportation plates he had made for Chester. The mage asked where she was being held and how many guards were around. But Chester explained that direct intervention might be too risky, and suggested that Callum act under his direction. Callum refused, freedom of choice being more important to him. But after a while, he agreed to work with Chester. Chester told him that one of the guild offices was deep in the woods and it was almost impossible to get there on foot. He offered blueprints of the building, even though they might be out of date. One of the werewolves can take a teleportation beacon with him and leave it in a hidden location to help Callum get to the right place. Meanwhile, in prison, Lucy started to go crazy, not realizing what was going on around her. She was approached by a woman named Gail Hargrave, who put her hand on her head, healing her. Gail asked if Lucy knew Callum Wells, to which Lucy replied that she had spoken to him but had never seen him in person. Gail was interested in the reason why Callum decided to teach her destructive healing and ruin her life. This was the first time Lucy had heard of such a thought. She didn't think Callum wanted to hurt her. Gail, on the other hand, didn't believe in coincidence. She would wait for him to get answers about what he had done to her. Meanwhile, Gail's father asked the agent if they were sure the perpetrator was coming. Ray replied that they had made no attempt to conceal the location of Lucy's holdup. Gail's father stated that she was now not his daughter and handed over the abdication papers. The agent thanked for the signature. Lucy was no longer affiliated with the guild. The most powerful beings gathered in the study. Hargrave realized that everyone wanted a piece of Callum. He had ruined her granddaughter's career. But there wasn't enough for everyone. Duval declared that, as a dimensional mage, he belonged to her. Tyson reminded him that no one had yet been able to curb his powers, but Duvalier suggested locking him in the V's dryer and forcing him to cast spells for decades. Jean reported that they had taken the teleportation plates from Alpha Chester. Everyone now knew that Callum was plotting against them. War was becoming inevitable. Dumas asked a question about vampires. Callum killed his brothers. Jean noted that when they found out who else was working with him, they would take action, but so far there was no definitive information. Tyson studied the reports. Everything indicated that Wells was acting alone. Hargrave remarked that with only one mage against them, there shouldn't be a problem. Tyson asked Duvala if she could suppress Callum's spatial abilities. She assured him that the effects would be the same as on other mages. But spatial magic is too unpredictable. Callum is only a heretic, and once he's here, caught or dead, he won't leave. Meanwhile, Callum has made his way to the cave where he is supposed to open the portal. The words of Alf Chester came to mind. Everyone was waiting for him. The guild, the archmages, those he had pissed off. Chester reminded him that this was not a contract killing of vampires, but a real war. Every available resource will be arrayed against him. Every agent, every observer who can glamorize. They were all eager to capture him. Callum already knew that. He stepped confidently into the portal. His enemies hadn't done enough to stop him.